Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue à la deuxième journée, ou plutôt deuxième matinée de ce colloque international. J'espère que vous avez bien dormi. Au cas où vous n'étiez pas là hier matin, my name is Lucie Dupaquier. I'm head of scientific expertise and publication at the Foundation Jean Monnet. And my role today is to accompany you through this colloquium. For info, every panel is followed by a Q&A, and at the end of each Q&A, you'll hear the gong, which means it's time for a break. You'll have coffee and refreshments right outside. So today we have the second day of the colloquium, les marges de manœuvre et les acteurs de décisions d'intégration européenne en période de crise de l'ordre mondial de 1950 à 2024. Yesterday, we were more in the 20th century. Today, we're going to enter into the 21st and the future. So, for this first panel, I'd like to greet Mrs. Lara Picardo. She's professor of political science and international politics at the University of Genova. And she's going to talk to us about from the Normandy format to the whole-out Ukraine war. And I'd also like to welcome Philippe Strobel, who's a scientific collaborator at the Hildesheim University in the History Institute. And he'll be talking to us about the European migration issue in 2015. And finally, all of this will be animated by Jean-Philippe Lerèche, who's an honorary professor here at the University of Lausanne in political science. Please have a warm welcome for them. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this morning. With the panel 5, we have two very important issues for Europe. The two topics raise general questions about Europe as a continental power and its role in the world. You have and I invite you to come after. You have 20 minutes for each presentation. Then we will have 40 minutes of discussion with the public, with the audience, after the two presentations. And we begin with Dr. Philippe Strobel, Privat Docent at the Institute for Contemporary History at the University of Vienna. You are welcome for the conference.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the organizers for having me here. It's a very great opportunity, and I think it's interesting that a historian will start giving you an introduction into issues of the 21st century, but I promise you I will do my best. And today I will talk about the European migration issue and political communication in Central Eastern Europe, and more specifically about political decision makers and their influences between 2015 and 2017. Crises, as we can see, reveal dormant conflicts, or such conflicts that are just waiting to break out. This is in particularly true for the EU's dealing with migration after 2015. The increased influx of refugees into the European Union increased the ideological divide between the European core countries, if you will, and the countries of the CEE region. After a strong peak of asylum applications, the EU core around Germany, France, the Netherlands, but also Sweden, advocated for a united approach, and the EU Commission tried to find a solution on a European level. By that time, however, a bloc of member states, mainly in the eastern and central part of the EU, had been formed that rejected the joint European action plan. In all cases, restrictive political communication on migration has helped political decision makers to capitalize on a mounting fear about migration. And that helped them to attract additional voters. In introducing this cause, decision makers were interconnected with their colleagues in the region. And for example, Viktor Orban's Hungary, as we will see, served as a think tank in where decision makers from the region could find inspiration. And this presentation, just see, here we are, yes. This presentation focuses on policymakers and their political communication about migration and security in Hungary. You can see the countries marked in yellow here. Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Austria between 2015 and 2017. These EU member countries had developed a media-effective approach to oppose discussions for a joint European action plan. In this sense, the events of 2015-2016 marked a turning point when large sections of the CEE region acted united in their rejection of accepting refugees. They portrayed migration increasingly as an existential challenge that would undermine the economic substance and the cultural identity of their own countries unless met with great determination and with a great determination to reject refugees. Today, I want to give a brief overview about the main political decision makers in the region and their approaches to establish national lines to handle and communicate migration. I highlight and analyze their political communication, their networking processes, as well as the reasons for their rejection of a joint European solution. Well, let me start with Hungary. Hungary's politics can be seen as the ultimate antithesis to a cooperative understanding of how the influx of refugees should be dealt with on a wider European level. As we will see, communicating and implementing a tough course towards migration and portraying oneself as a defender of European Christianity, that was a strategy Prime Minister Viktor Orban discovered already very early. In developing his anti-immigration communication, Orban mainly relied on the advice of a younger expert. You can see it here. It's the legal expert and lawyer Balázs Orbán. Both of them are not related. He had joined his government as legal advisor in 2009. In 2015, when the government decided to make the migration issue a top priority in their communication, he became the first director of the so-called Migration Research Institute. You can see the first page of their homepage over here. This institute is a new think tank established by the illiberal, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Zsazsadvek Foundation and the private university Matthias Corvinus Collegium. Both institutions were aiming at supporting the governmental line. And this specific institute was aiming at supporting the government's line with research and criticizing EU solution as well as warning from Muslim immigration. When the government saw itself confronted by a stream of corruption allegations in early 2015, they began to use the potential of migration, of a migration debate, by speaking about the dangers of immigration, implying that the vast majority of migrants, of refugees, were economic migrants, which tried to abuse the Hungarian welfare system. In spring 2015, the government started an official campaign which they called a National Consultation on Immigration and Terrorism. And every Hungarian received a questionnaire with highly biased questions that strongly suggested that only the rejection of refugees would be a reasonable position. You can see the questions of that questionnaire over there. In a June resolution, the European Commission and the Parliament criticized the consultation as highly misleading, biased, and unbalanced. The very predictable results of these surveys were of course used to justify the restrictive governmental line. This often called, or very frequently called, communication stunt became necessary in the eyes of Orban and his advisors because they were losing voters to the far-right Jobbik party at the time. And at the time, this party was about to become Hungary's second largest, if not largest, party. Orban aimed at regaining voters by outflanking Jobbik by the far right. And migration for him seemed to be the right tool. He also sought to establish himself as a leading voice of the anti-immigration movement within Europe. And he heavily criticized attempts to handle the influx of refugees on a joint European level, and especially the distribution of refugees. At the same time, he presented himself as someone able to act by realizing measures that were not so much effective to deal with the existing humanitarian problem, but could rather be used for marketing purposes and to present the government as an acting force. The government, for example, refused to proportionally expand financial means, allocations for aiding the new arrivals. Instead, financial means were media effectively redirected to the police and the building of a border fence. In addition, the Orban government became increasingly alarmist in its communication. From summer 2015 on, it mentioned that migrants were invading Europe, and this could be very dangerous and could destroy the continent if not halted. This radical political communication led to a vicious circle that caused a further tightening of the tough politics against refugees and migration as a whole in Hungary. By mid-2015, Orban and his party, the Fidesz party, have established themselves as the authority on migration, leaving not much space for Jobbik. At that time, Fidesz cause has so widely shifted to the far right that even a Jobbik official admitted that it would be difficult to flank the government from the right. As a consequence, Jobbik was quickly losing ground to Fidesz, mainly because of the migration issue that now has dominated the public discourse. And as we see, the 2017 parliamentary elections in Hungary showed that Orban's strategy, at least for the time, had paid off. Fidesz became by far the largest party in the Hungarian parliament, and Jobbik only managed to get on the third position. And the radicalization in Orban's communication also became a success because of the lack of a strong opposition. I mean, that was also a major point. The largest party on the left spectrum, the Hungarian Socialist Party, obviously did not know how to respond and took, as I found in a research study about the time, took a leave of absence from the debate around migration. Well, I explained a little bit more about Hungary. Now I would like to move on to Poland. In 2015-2016, Poland was not at the center of the main refugee movement. Nevertheless, migration was not popular in Poland, and the governing center-right party, the Civic Platform, PO, they tried to chart a course between the EU's efforts of solving the crisis collectively and a rejection of cooperation. This balancing act was particularly necessary because the party had generally pursued a more moderate urban and liberal course than other populist parties in the CE region. Also, Prime Minister Eva Kapac's predecessor, Donald Tusk, was elected president of the European Council at that time. Consequently, his party was involved in EU politics and could not simply torpedo EU politics on a domestic level. The party claimed that they were willing to cooperate. Solidarity, however, must always be in line with the country's capabilities. The comparatively moderate stance towards asylum seekers did not pay off for the government. During the May 2015 presidential election, the opposition candidate Andrzej Duda of the right-wing populist Law and Justice Party PiS won unexpectedly, mainly due to his party's strong stance against migration. When the PO government agreed in summer 2015 that it would take up additional refugees, the opposition party PiS highly exploited that decision. And that had had most probably learned from Hungary and Slovakia that exploiting fears of migration had a huge potential to win voters, and it made migrants the dominant issue, the dominant topic of its electoral campaign. And the October 2015 parliamentary elections brought a landslide victory for peace, which secured almost 40% of all votes. As a result, the new government position had shifted from modest policy compromises to an urban-style harsh critics and a total policy obstructionism at the EU level. Who was responsible for deciding over the new course? Since we ask here for decision makers and their advisors. In contrast to other states, the key decisions were neither taken by the new prime minister nor by the new president. Instead, the founder and the head of the Peace Party, Jarosław Kaczyński, was de facto ruler. Every big decision, as the political magazine Politico described, every big decision goes through his office. He also made no secret of his admiration for Orban and his desire to imitate his policies. And the 2015 change in Polish politics was accompanied by an intensified exchange between Kaczynski and the Hungarian Prime Minister. Both of them held regular personal consultations, which they also used to fine-tune and develop their stance towards migrants and their critique of the EU refugee politics. Well, now I would like to move on to Slovakia. Slovakia took a similar course as Hungary. From early 2015 on, there was a close exchange between the Prime Minister Robert Fico and his Hungarian counterpart. This was particularly interesting since Fico's party was committed, or actually should be committed to social democratic principles, while his illiberal Hungarian right-wing pendant had a considerable history of disagreements with Fico. At latest, since Orban's government had started handing out Hungarian passports to Slovak citizens in 2010. At that time, Fico, who later lauded Orban for many things, criticized him as irredentist and as a danger for Central Europe. In the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015, Fico began to rail against the dangers of a Muslim migration and especially against the perceived dangers of a multicultural society. In the wake of the March 2016 parliamentary elections, Fico stepped up his communication on immigration and on migration. And like Orban, he publicly rejected the mandatory quota proposed by the European Commission. In contrast to Hungary, however, Slovakia has not been affected by an influx of migrants. I think in 2015, there were 169 applications for asylum in Slovakia. Also, Fico's rhetoric encountered opposition. The most important voice was the country's president, Andrej Kiska, who took a very strong stance against the government's communication. Decisions in Slovakia were taken by Fico in his position as prime minister and the leader of the governing party, Smer. At latest, since the election campaign of 2015, Fico and Orban again went into close exchange. The growing influence of Hungarian ideas of political communication had even been picked up by the country's press. And typical headlines of that time were Fico is only stealing ideas from Orban, or Fico seeks inspiration in Orban. However, in contrast to Hungary and Poland, when aggressive communication of the migration issue paid off for the communicating parties, Fico's anti-immigration campaign cannot be seen as a total success. On the one hand, of course, he managed to secure himself a third term, but on the other hand, his party had lost a considerable amount of votes. Fico did obviously not manage to be seen as the authority on immigration, on migration, as Orban did, for example. As the election surprisingly showed, Fico's bet on immigration fears have benefited other candidates. And, for example, the far-right party of Marian Kotleba won 8.2% of the votes and came into the parliament. And in this context, the political analyst Ottilia Dant had stated that imaginary immigrants, because there were none in Slovakia, imaginary immigrants had brought very real neo-Nazis into the Slovakian parliament. Well, now I would like to move on to my last sample, to Austria, the country where I come from. Austria differed from its Central Eastern European neighbors in some cases. Nevertheless, an intensive rapprochement took place with its eastern neighbors from 2015 on. The country had a long history of immigration since, at latest since 1945, and it was the only country discussed here where a genuine policy-centered public discourse about refugee policies was already present in early 2015. Also, Austria felt the consequences of the war-related migration from the Middle East earlier than other countries. At that time, the country was governed by a coalition of the Social Democrats, the SPÖ, and the conservative party ÖVP. Within the government, primarily the ÖVP was pushing for a harder line towards asylum seekers and easier possibilities to deport them. Until summer 2015, however, despite an increasingly aggressive tone from the ÖVP, both governing parties were on the same course in supporting a joint European approach to distribute migrants. As the crisis deepened during summer 2015, conservative voices became louder in calling for a restrictive solution. Sebastian Kurz, you can see him over here. At that time, he was the foreign minister of the country. He had obviously realized the potential the migration issue could provide. And during that time, the ÖVP distanced itself from its social democratic coalition partner and expressed an increasing sympathy for politics in Hungary. Also, Austria's third main party, the right-wing FPÖ, the Freedom Party, that had instrumentalized the migration issue since the 1990s, received massive increases in regional elections. For example, in Vienna, they became the second strongest party. They were influenced by the ideas, just to name another advisor, the ideas of another political advisor, today's head of the party, Herbert Kickl, who have developed the anti-immigration program for the Freedom Party. While the ÖVP responded by problematizing security fears, the SPÖ, the Social Democrats, in short, took a leave of absence from the debate on the domestical issue. The numbers of arrivals of refugees increased further during the fall 2015, and the ÖVP foreign minister, who had by then developed plans to take over chancellorship, had tightened the party's line on asylum issues, advocating for asylum caps, for example, and railing against Muslim extremist kindergartens in social democratic Vienna. By early 2016, the government's communication about migration had been entirely taken over by the ÖVP and especially by Mr. Kurz. In developing his policies, Kurz was supported by his closest political advisor, just to name another one, the legal expert Stefan Steiner, who had started advising Kurz in 2011, when Kurz made him the head of his newly established State Secretariat for Integration. He described Steiner as his most important sparring partner, with whom he discussed every major political decision. Steiner, frequently described as an illiberal hardliner, is deeply rooted in Catholic faith, according to insiders. He developed the slogan "Integration through Performance," which became the central slogan of Kurz's work as State Secretary and of his work as Foreign Minister. Steiner's personal task at advisor in 2015, according to insiders, was the rejection of an open door policy, a so-called Willkommenskultur. Accordingly, he shaped Kurz's tough line towards migration and integration. And from January 2016 on, Kurz spoke relentlessly about the so-called closing of the Balkan route. In his position as a foreign minister, he used the recurring format of the so-called West Balkan Conference, the conference of the West Balkan countries, that has been in existence since 2013, and he used it to announce the closing of that route. Representatives of the EU, of Germany, of Greece, all the countries that were mainly affected, were not invited. Since 2016, as Michael Gehler has written 2 years ago, we could also see a targeted rejection of a collaborative European migration policy. Kurz also joined his CE neighbors by criticizing the proposed European system of just distributions of asylum seekers. In taking over a tougher course of communication, Kurz and his advisor Steiner drew on successfully tested role models. Internationally, they found inspiration in Hungary, and Kurz and Orban's relationship was described by members of their staff, both of their staffs, as close friendship. While relying on successful modes of communication that played with the fears of the population, Kurz began to restructure his party. His guiding motive was centered around the classics of migration and security. A combination of frequent media ads by his and other ÖVP ministries, commissioned surveys, as well as the frequent presentation of catchy migration-critical comments brought additional publicity. And in 2017, he took over the leadership of his party, and he then provoked the breaking up of the coalition. The following early elections of October 2017 were to a large degree centered around migration and integration, and they brought a huge success for him. His new ÖVP became the strongest party in the parliament, and this paved the way for a new coalition between the ÖVP and the FPÖ that moved further in line with their CEA neighbors. You can see here the inauguration of the ÖVP-FPÖ government in December 2017. And now, since I'm a little bit over time, I would like to move on to my conclusion. The influx of refugees had shaped political communication and politics and increased the ideological divide within the European Union. Influencing the electorate by nationalist rhetoric, sometimes coupled with authoritarian, illiberal values, turned out to be a very powerful tool for policymakers in the region. The samples analyzed here had used discussions around migration, discussions around security to mobilize voters. In all cases, the system was very simple. At first, they opposed joint measures on a European level, which would have needed a compromise, a European compromise, as we heard yesterday from many speakers. This was combined by the media effective claim that the policy on a European level could not work out and would never work out. In the next step, they implemented media-effective unilateral measures aiming at showing their capability to act on a national level. And the rejection of a European compromise generated its own success, if you will, for national players. Because their key underlying argument was that the EU would never be able to manage the crisis. And without compromises, as we heard yesterday, that was inevitably the case. Their politics worked out, if ever, to different degrees. In Hungary and Austria, which were both more strongly affected by migration and by migration flows, it worked differently than in Slovakia, where Fico's party had even lost votes to extremist other parties. Also, we observed that these anti-migration communication campaigns had a bigger success because the opposition in all countries analyzed here was unable, for some reasons, unable to respond. And there were no considerable public counter position for disagreeing citizens. We saw that close links existed between all the party leaders, between Kaczynski, Fico, and Kurz, and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who had managed to present himself, or tried to present himself, as a role model. He had in many cases, and not only in migration issues, as you all will know better than I do, walked the tightrope, showing his neighbors what he can get away with. On the one hand, the political exploitation of migration and security has led to considerable successes for policymakers and for their advisors in the region. The lack of solidarity and the turning away from a joint European search for compromises, however, has prevented lasting European solutions. And so, almost 10 years later, migration continues to be an issue that highly divides the EU. We will only see how the Migration and Asylum Pact that was concluded very recently in May will be implemented by the member states. They have time until, I think, June 2026. Orban, that's my last sentence, Orban, however, has already described this pact as another nail in the coffin of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philippe, for your very interesting, stimulating presentation. We have discussion after the second speaker, and I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Lara Picardo. She's Associate Professor at the University of Genova to the Department of Political and International Sciences. She's Specialist of History of International Relations. Her research interests are history of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Russia, history of Eastern Europe, history of European integration in general. Lara, you have the floor for 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thanks, a warm thanks to all the organization of this wonderful conference. I really enjoy it, very interesting. And thanks to Professor Geller, but also to Madame Trois-Fontaine, Madame Fontane, who really helped me in the organization of the travel and whatever. So thank you so much to everyone here now. I have this specific topic entering into the 21st century related to a specific moment and a specific area, that is Eastern Europe, more specifically Ukraine and Russia, between the establishment of the Normandy format, and it is 6 June 2014, and the breakout of the war, meaning the 24th of February 2022, so meaning 8 years more or less. In order to try to organize my presentation, in order to answer to the questions that we have to answer to, I would like, and I have to do three, let's say, little premises to my speech. The first is related to the fact that the war that was after a long crisis has not just one cause, obviously, as you know, and all the causes are really rooting in history. So when I'm talking about history, I'm saying starting from the Middle Ages. I would simply quote to you and remember to you the fact that actually in the Slavic culture, we had two Slavic cultures primarily. The first one is the so-called Kievan Rus, and the second one was the Moscovian Rus. They were born in different moments. The previous one, the first one was the Kievan one, then we have the Moscovian, then they lived together for several centuries, and then they were put together thanks, let's say, to a political expansion of the Moscovian Rus. So it means that historically we have two Russias. This is the first point. And for those traveling, for example, in Kiev, they are going to find in the main square, the famous Maidan, a marble in which there is written in Ukrainian, "Here the Slavic culture starts." So the first point is that we have at least two culture about the Slavs culture. And I'm underlining this because just yesterday, when we were at the dinner at the Jean Monnet Foundation, I found a publication by Professor Robert Belot in French. It was about the use that Putin is making about history. So how he is changing, let's say, the narrative, not really the history, but the way of saying things in order to I wouldn't say justify, because for him it's not a justification, but it's to explain to others who cannot understand something that must be obvious. And actually, in that publication, Professor Bellot correctly remembered an article published by Vladimir Putin on July 2021, in which he is saying that Ukraine and Russia are simply the same. He's not saying something like that in order to say we are together, we can stay together, we are friends. The idea is much more, how can I say, precise. He intended to say that there is no need in order to keep divide Ukraine and Russia must be extended into the Ukrainian land. Second point, if you are wondering, what about Belarus? Is it correct? Belarus is the third, let's say, Slavic culture. They are called the White Russians, but in any case, for them, at the moment, a kind of merging with Russia, it's not a problem. Since Putin has a good relation with Lukashenko, the more or less promise between the two is that Lukashenko is a kind of prince inside a big empire, and he can stay over there more or less until the end of his days. I would like to remember that Lukashenko is president of Belarus since 1993, so let's say quite a long mandate, more or less. The second premise that I would like to underline to you that although this difference between Ukraine on the one side and Russia on the other side, I have to underline that even Ukraine inside contains different Ukraines, plural. I'm sorry to get you so confused, but in any case, we have to take into consideration the fact that we are not taking into consideration a state that is for sure a unitarian state. Another historical example, I would like to remember that just during and after the First World War, Ukraine, how can I say, freed itself from the Russian Empire, but two different Ukrainian republics were born. The western part, also thanks to the German invasion, I have to say, but in any case, the western part intended to build itself as a kind of democratic republic, while the eastern part that was so close to Russia, so a little bit far from Poland, intended to rebuild as a kind of friend of something that is going to become the Soviet Union. So we have the Western Ukraine Republic and the Soviet Eastern Ukrainian Republic. You have to consider this aspect also because Ukraine in history suffered a lot of invasions. And even if, for example, nowadays Poland is so friend of Ukraine, for a long period Poland had very huge interest in that territory, as Russia did. So it is often said that Ukraine suffers of the relations between the two neighbors, Poland on the one side and Russia on the other. Third and last premise, so that I can enter into the actors of this situation, is related to the fact that we are looking at the eastern part of Europe with a very specific and original history, so please don't think that the idea of Machiavelli of having the advisor of the prince is valid everywhere. Try to think to the Slavic history nowadays. I don't think you are going to find, can I say, chancellors in your mind. Probably you can remember, I don't know, Potemkin with Catherine the Great, maybe Rasputin. Was he an advisor? I don't know. I'm simply saying maybe Rasputin. And then in any case, it doesn't matter if I'm talking about a Tsar or a Soviet leader, you won't find an advisor. You're going to find the so-called loyal man. So the man who is loyal to the leader. That is definitely a different figure from or by, let's say, the advisor. But now let's start to try to find which are the actors of these situations. And I have to say that here we have two let's say, kind of actors. Those who are involved and those who cannot be involved. So we have a double size, a double view about that. And about the actors, I would like to say that we have not only men, but we have also international organizations, because actually the solutions that are not be found yet are passing also toward international organization. I would like to start from international organization, so international forum, more or less. Let's try to remember how the situation started in 2013, so just before the establishment of the Normandy format. I would like to remember that in Ukraine at those time there was a president called Yanukovych. He was a pro-Russian Ukrainian president. And when the European Union, especially the European Commission, proposed a new agreement called Eastern Partnership, only the young students in Kiev decided to ask to Yanukovych to sign and ratify the Eastern Agreement. So the real beginning was simply a student protest, simply saying that it was not so, how can I say, big, huge, or it was not a news for the international journalism. It was simply a protest. Then Yanukovych, that didn't absolutely intend to participate into the Eastern Partnership because he already got the proposal from Russia to join the Euro-Asian Custom Union, that is an alternative, is a kind of out, or the Custom Union or the European Union. So Yanukovych intended to go on that side. He decided not to listen to the protest, and he decided to let the so-called Berkut, that is the special police, to intervene, and a lot of students were killed. So the protest rised up because the mothers and then the fathers and then Ukrainians started to protest. In this case, the protests were to defend the young Ukrainians, but also to put Yanukovych out of the power, okay? And they started to say Ukraine to Ukrainians. The protest went on until February, but unfortunately, nationalism is always calling nationalism. And as soon as the Ukrainian nationalism came out, also the Russian nationalism came out. So it means that the Russian minorities started to protest. And so here we have the first actors, European Union. European Union was considered in that moment, unfortunately, the last cause of these protests. So even if the European Union was so able to solve several crises in Eastern Europe, such as the Russian-Georgian War, such as, for example, the transfrontalier problems of Ukraine and Moldova, was not able, let's say, to play an active role in that moment, in that scenario. So the European Union should change more or less its approach. You have also to take into consideration that in any case, the European Union is made by members, as you, well, it's obvious, but in any case, the European Union do not have a common, let's say, foreign policy. So it means that, for example, the Spanish attitude towards Russia, it's not the German one or the Polish one. So it means that in any case, something that is a cooperation, let's say, in foreign policy cannot be used in this specific moment. The European Union so decided to wait, the concept of wait and see, hoping also that other intergovernmental and international organizations could act on that scenario. Then let's try to look at the other. UN, should I say something? There is the procedure of the veto power. So what about the permanent members, Russia and US? Which kind of solution can the Security Council take in this decision? It is obvious. Veto power would be played by Russia, and it was the case. So the UN cannot act in that area. And just to try to pass over very quickly to another international organization, some politician quoted it, and it is something that is freezing. I mean, someone said, we can use NATO. Well, NATO means to rise up the level of the war. That's the only point. You have to take into consideration that NATO, obviously, as you know, has this Article 5 in order to intervene, but in any case, for those members of the alliance. And in any case, you have also to remember that NATO tried, in any case, to produce an effect with Russia, because since the collapse of the Soviet Union was organized an agreement with Russia called the Partnership for Peace that was then translated into a council, a NATO-Russia Council. The NATO-Russia Council was established as a mechanism for consultation, but also consensus building, but also cooperation for joint actions. But as soon as Russia annexed Crimea, this council was suspended. The only thing that was maintained was the colloquium between the two partners. Unfortunately, the colloquium have been suspended with the breakout of the war. And now I would like to quote just the last things, because I'm looking at the fact that the time is going very, very fast. And so I would like to underline that being the main international organization, let's say, out of play in this moment, so UN, EU, and NATO, other way in order to solve the solution must be found. At this time, thanks to Angela Merkel, and I think that we really missed her in this situation, because she really proved to understand and to more or less try to propose solutions over there. Thanks to Angela Merkel, another international, regional, I would say, organization was involved. It is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that was involved thanks to the Normandy format. The Normandy format was a kind of informal forum in order to let Russia and Ukraine speak together under the aegis of other diplomats. Not only France and Germany, obviously they were the two main partners, but thanks to a much more formal organization that was the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. It's not the case if, thanks to this framework, thanks to this organization, the Normandy format produced a trilateral forum made by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe plus Ukraine and Russia. Thanks to this trilateral forum, the two Minsk protocols were signed and ratified. The two agreements were related to the fact that the immediate ceasefire was necessary first, and second, while Russia should abandon the Ukrainian territory, Ukraine must adopt strong reform according to a new kind of autonomous for Crimea, but also for the two, let's say, republic of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. The agreements were never respected. This is the effect. Never respected in the fact that nor Ukraine, neither Russia decided to act positively according to the agreement. And all the two decided in any case to try to keep on using more or less violence in order to be stronger than the others. Try also to remember that the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe tried to organize a so-called special monitoring mission. I don't know why in that area everything must be special. It's well, probably because the area is special. But in any case, this special monitoring mission simply produced a report in order to say that it was a humanitarian catastrophe. So something different should be found. Actually, all the channels, all the diplomatic channels, international channels, and so on, didn't find a solution since 24 February 2022, when Putin decided to start with the special military operation. I would like to underline that he never declared war to Ukraine, because up to him, Ukraine, it's not a state. So it means that no need for a formal war declaration. You can simply enter the territory and do more or less whatever you want. Then, what about the two main actors in the war nowadays, Zelensky and Putin? The most important thing to understand is that they have a different approach, obviously, to leadership. And while Zelensky is much more, let's say, close to a Western model, more or less, also because he needed to be a Westerner, in the sense that he really depending on the help from Western. Putin is keeping on using the same traditional Slav kind of leadership. If you remember the first beginning images of the war, I think you can easily remember, for example, Zelensky surrounded by his militaries and his ministers in the street, proving that he was there in order to defend Ukraine together with Ukrainians. If you remember, and if you move your mind in Russia, you're going to find Putin sitting alone in a very golden table, and all the others were on the back of the room standing, and he was making question, and he was making joke of their answers, because he has his own idea, and he pretended to, in any case, have the correct idea. So the thing is that Putin, more or less, is not alone, but he is the only leader, although he cannot avoid several loyal men. The loyal men of Putin are more or less two. His spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, who is always, let's say, presenting in a more official way Putin's thinking. And the second one, I think you can guess, Lavrov, the powerful minister of a foreign office. And then last, and I'm closing, we have Elvira Nabiulina. I hope you can remember. She is the governor of the Central Russian Bank. Thanks to her, the European and Western sanctions are not hitting directly Russia, and moreover, Nabiulina was able to make a big reserve of foreign currencies and to avoid a strong inflection of Russia. Being such the situation, which is my conclusion, the conclusion is that some change must be done in the actors in order to try to find a way to solve the situation, but the situation must not be solved with an agreement. We need really a treaty, because in that area, agreements means coming back to the situation of the frozen conflict. And the frozen conflict is for sure a future war. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lara, for your very interesting presentation. Now we have time for discussion, for question. Do you have any question? Probably, because it's very important issues. Migration, Ukraine. We will begin with a question. Yes.
So I would like to invite the speakers to kind of bring their thoughts together to the current time. And I forgive the fact that students have left the room. They were asking this question all the time. Because I think the migration pact that we learned towards the end of your presentation is giving us memories of the 2015 period. At the same time, we're looking now at a period that very nicely in the expose of Lara about the war that's very hot right now. And these things are interconnected, right? Because after the migration crisis of 2015, we got the Ukrainian crisis, which benefited in a funny way from our knowledge that we had such a major fallout from the migration crisis, not just in the countries you represented, but also ultimately Brexit and the rise of the extreme right in other places in Europe. But that does give us right now a moment to reflect on the interconnection of the migrant crisis and our the European response to what's happening geopolitically. So maybe I could ask both to, in a sense, respond to the broader issues of where Europe stands geopolitically on these issues that are triggered by migration and our foreign relation with our foreign neighbors. Thank you.
We will answer you.
Okay. Yes, the question of migration is affecting also the Ukrainian situation, in the sense that Poland, who is really interesting in hard, let's say, politics by the European Union versus Russia, is acting, for example, for the Ukrainian refugees in a different way than other kind of migrations. Coming from Italy, I can say to you that while Italy was trying to effort the situation of the Mediterranean Sea with, how can I say, moment of difficulties actually, Poland that were asked to keep quotes, let's say, of migrants refused. So more or less we had to share the quote of migrants in other situation. Then when the Ukrainian-Russian war exploded, Poland decided to host the refugees. It was obviously a humanitarian aid, so it is an honor that Poland did something like that. But it was, on the other side, obvious that even the migration policies is used in order to push state interest inside the European Union. Maybe my answer, it's very hard, but it was the impression that we got from Italy.
We have a question. Yes, you can answer.
Sure. No, it's. Does it work?
Yes, it's okay. Hello? Take this.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a very important issue because the axis that was forming, which I was mentioned, got some serious tensions because of the security issues concerning that had arisen with the Ukraine war. I mean, also if you think that Poland was unable to take up 7,000 refugees in 2015 and later on took over hundreds of thousands, even more of, or millions of Ukrainian refugees, and they were not only at first, but for a very long period welcomed in the country, that's something very interesting. And also we can see what we could see between Poland and Hungary, Poland before the last elections and Hungary, that there were increasing tensions because of Orban's proximity to Putin. And this, of course, shook this newly forming cooperation between the CE countries.
We have a question with Joachim Bitterlich.
I would like to stick for a moment to migration. Frankly spoken, I'm puzzled by your approach, Mr. Strobel, because you are hiding to some extent what I call 2015, 2014, 2015 as what I call basics of a migration, let's say, crisis in Europe. Role of Merkel. She did not stop at the border. I understand why. But she missed one key situation. And this key had been not only suggested by, let's say, Hungarians or Austrians or others, but even by the European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Avramopoulos, in this time. Why didn't she, let's say, convoke for a seminar on the weekend at Meseberg, the famous place near Berlin, the leaders of Southeastern Europe? Because at that period, Orban told to all the people, I'm the only loyal EU member state because I execute EU policy at my border. It's one side. And then I'm a witness of the Austrian EU presidency 2018, where, let's say, Kurz was not alone, nor Kickl. The ÖVP has been trying, let's say, to neutralize to some extent the existence of Kickl during that period. And I've been working with these people and with the European Commission at the same time. By the way, European Commission services extremely helpful, 10 times more than the Commissioner on Home Affairs. And we have been, let's say, neutralizing, let's say, certain aspects of, let's say, Kickl's attempt. He was, in fact, not present. Our problem during that time to establish or to, let's say, to come nearer to a common policy were not the four at all. The four were not stopping at all our efforts. Poland, I see a bit different than you see it. Hungary, too. Slovakia is a special case because you have to understand it through its history with Hungary. And therefore, we have been trying this approach. And our real problem during that period was the lack of interest of the Germans and of the French, far away from any, let's say, migration reality. Seehofer and Collomb, the French interior minister, looking for the Maghreb, but not for the Balkans at all. And the Germans, let's say, let's call it helpless. They didn't know what to do. And on the other side, the real problem we had in the council was Italy. Italy, the new government, inside with a famous Italian interior minister who was pretending to speak about migration, but he was far away from migration. Not proposing any solution, nothing. And it's strange for me, the real, let's say, situation you have to see is the period 2015-2018. Not this extract 15-17. I have a different view on it. But why, let's say, Germany and France did not do anything, let's say, to be helpful insofar? Why the Italians, let's say, were, let's say, a blocking power to some extent? Everyone knew about, let's say, Italy's specific situation with regard to migration, yes. Everyone was, let's say, had a certain understanding in favor of, let's say, the warring sides of Italy to this. But the problem was the Italian minister. More than, let's say, not a troubleshooter even, let's say, but a worrying figure in the council. And with leading powers, let's call it out of order. Much more than Orban. Orban, we were able to catch him up, yes, and to integrate him. Poland did not play any role because Poland had this, let's say, feeling of we don't want to see migrants. Perhaps Christian migrants from Ukraine, yes, but that's all, no one else. Please do not send any, let's say, migrant from Syria, etc., to Poland. But Poland was not, let's say, playing any role in this game. The problem was, let's say, the Austrians, we were able to neutralize Kickl at that period, without any assistance from Berlin, by the way. But we were just not able, let's say, to formulate a real policy. That's my analysis today. I reserve to come back to Ukraine, but it's another story.
Philip, what do you think about?
Very interesting. Thank you very much for that thoughts, because as I mentioned, I'm a historian. I'm not so much into the policy making itself, but I was focused here on political communication in those countries and the strategies of what didn't get.
Communication and policy are two different sides.
And No, it was extremely interesting to see, or it would be interesting to put it into a larger European framework, of course. And what you mentioned is, of course, very interesting. You mentioned the European Union managed to mutualize Orban. Could you tell me a little bit more about it? Because he would not see it that way.
Well, as a matter of fact, I know Viktor Orban since now 32 years. We met several times with Chancellor Kohl, and we agreed from the beginning this will be a difficult chap. Not easy at all, an untypical liberal, difficult to control. And Orban's change has to do with, let's say, something with an American interference in Hungary, with Soros, the famous Soros Foundation creating a university in Budapest. For him, for Orban, this was an attempt, let's say, to change Hungary deeply. And this is one of the key moments of Orban's change of policy. But he needed something to be taken seriously by others, to be part of a discussion, not to be considered as an outsider. And this was the key for discussing with him. Once you had him in the discussion, it was much more easy, let's say, to convince him and to guide him to some extent towards a certain policy. I've seen this with regard to the Balkans, to the Western Balkan policy, where Orban was desesperated by, let's say, the non-approach of Brussels and the non-existing understanding in Western Europe. The French did not understand at all what's happening there. They were not even interested in, besides Serbia to some extent. But the whole Western Europe had not any, let's say, feeling for the Western Balkans. Orban has been trying during 2 years to convince the other Europeans, let's say, to develop a policy. And I will never forget, I passed half a night with Jean-Claude Juncker and Viktor Orban, discussing how to develop a new approach towards the Western Balkans, including the refugee situation. And the problem was what I call the lack of interest of Western European leaders towards that situation. Juncker was desesperated because of this. Merkel did not look in any way to the Western Balkans. This was not her cup of tea, if you want. And we missed, let's say, the years between 2015, 2017, 18. For me, till that period, it was still possible, let's say, to catch Orban.
Very interesting. Thank you. Maybe I will ask later on in the discussion from the next panel a couple of questions, because that's extremely interesting, and also I think that's the value of this format here, to bring research and people from the practice together.
Do you want? Yes. Do you want to add something about this question, or we have a question of Michael Gehler?
Thank you.
Yes, just a few addition to Ambassador Bitterlich. I think that Poland has a very, very good excuse to be absent in the migration issue of 2015 and the years following, because Poland accepted hundreds of thousands of people coming from eastern Ukraine to Poland as refugees. As far as I know, 800,000 of eastern Ukrainians came to Poland after 2014 and so on. I would like to raise the question when we will come to Angela Merkel. I would like to raise the question if the migration issue was used to weaken Merkel's position within the European Union, to weaken the German's position. And I ask myself if the austerity policy concerning Greece and also the problems with which Italian has to face within the Eurozone was also used, the migration issue was used to take a kind of revenge against Merkel's, Berlin's, Brussels' Euro policy. I ask myself if the Euro policy is also linked with the refusal of accepting migrants from other southeastern parts and Syria and so on. What I would like to ask Philip, there was this deal with Turkey on the, keeping the migrants to Turkey. How would you judge this deal which was made? And also what kind of role Gerald Knaus played? He's a specialist on migration issue, an Austrian. Sometimes it is said he's advising political decision makers. What about the advice, the issue of advice? Was it used by Angela Merkel? Has she special migration advisors? I don't know, but I think it would be important to ask this question and to answer it. To Lara, just a few points. You mentioned very clearly and very convincingly that the European Union has no common foreign and security policy till today, and also not vis-à-vis the Ukraine. You mentioned the Maidan things. As far as I know, it was Frank-Walter Steinmeier as a foreign minister, and also the Polish one, Sikorski, and maybe also the French one. They went to the Maidan. They tried to mediate. They tried to be kind of diplomatic mediators, but obviously it was not successful. But why do you think it was not successful? Could it be prevented that Yanukovych then had to escape? And was it a kind of coup d'etat, or was it legal? Was it democratically? What then happened with Yasenyuk, for example? And the other thing is, what kind of role played the United States and the People's Republic of China? Because it's a bigger picture. I think it's not only a Ukrainian-Russian war between two, warriors, a defense warrior and an aggressive imperial warrior. On the one side, we have a national, regional warrior, a defense warrior, a reconquering warrior. On the other hand, we have an aggressive destruction warrior and an imperial warrior. So it's not only a war between warriors and nationalists. It's a global war. So how would you judge the People's Republic's China role and U.S. role? Think about Victoria Nuland, for example.
Thank you. Two questions. First for Philip and Lara, and after we will have a question of Pat Cox. And the answer shortly, please.
Yes, of course.
To have discussion with everybody.
Very short answer. My paper was focused on communication in the CEE regions. But what I could see was that all of those countries, especially Orban, he tried to present himself as a counterweight to this kind of liberal worldview he said that Merkel was providing at the time. And he suggested that he could provide something which others could join. And that was, I think that was the major point. About the alleged closing of the Balkan routes, I know that Knaus was extremely active. I mean, I'm sure we have better experts on his influence on Merkel during that time, but he was extremely active. I've read that, I've seen that also as a concerned citizen. But I can't really tell you exactly how much he was interfering into the negotiations or preparing for the negotiations.
Lara?
Yes, about the Maidan. First thing, I didn't precisely underline, I didn't have the time or I was not well organized. In any case, between EU and Russia, there is no agreement. So Russia is the closest neighbor of the EU without a formal agreement. From 1997 till 2007, There was a partnership and cooperation agreement. When it expired, Putin didn't renew it, but Brussels did exactly the same. So it means that there is no agreement between the two. And I would like to remember that, unfortunately for everyone, already in 2011, while discussing something related to Eastern approach of the European Union that was inside, yesterday we already heard it by Professor Lott, Romano Prodi, enlargement politics, and then he was proposing the neighborhood policy. Inside the neighborhood policy, Russia, but more specifically, the former Soviet countries were to be considered, meaning Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. It means that these 6 countries should be involved. In that moment, Lavrov, that we said that the loyal man of Putin, said, be careful because this is our home garden. So it means that, in any case, the warning already arrived, and it is clear that having to play with such an actor becomes everything so difficult. The role of the United States. I would like to remember that in November, in an hotel of Kiev, there was an American citizen called John O'Brien. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So it means that it is suspected that, in any case, an American role, even in the Euromaidan, especially with the contact of several policemen, was definitely clear. It is said that the relation between America and Russia obviously changed from Trump and then Biden, with the worsening of the situation. Also because the Pacific theater is pretty important both for Russia and for the United States. So it means that we have 2 mirrors in that area. You should take into consideration that more or less Russia intended to play a role between India and China, to be the mediators, let's say, and it intended also to make a kind of mediator during the Trump presidency with China and US. So it means that the situation is a very hard, complex play. Putin went to Beijing before starting the special operation, and no one knows what they said to each other, but it is clear he was asking for permission, more or less. That's the point. In any case, on the other side, China intended to have several Russian supports for, obviously, raw materials in part, but specifically in the Asian politics with, for example, Taiwan. So it means that inside Ukraine, we have more or less the whole world trying to play a role for its own interest.
Thank you. Last question. We have 5 minutes for the question and the answers. Please, Pat Cox.
So it's, forgive me, it's more an observation, and there's a very rich tapestry to choose from. I just want to speak very briefly about a critical period of several months between August of 2013 and November of 2013. I had the privilege, along with Alexander Kwasniewski, to work to try to liberate some of the political prisoners of Mr. Yanukovych. And so we had lots of meetings with him and with his Prime Minister Azarov. And apart from our mission, because you have to avoid mission creep, you know, we had eyes and ears. So we listened carefully, and it was very clear that the Ukrainian economy was heading for a macroeconomic financial crisis. And they needed very significant levels of macroeconomic assistance. The classic sources of that are IMF with conditionality, or in this case, because of the Eastern Partnership and the imminence of a deep and comprehensive free trade and association agreement with Ukraine, would the EU itself provide the funds. I noticed in our dialogue with Azarov, and we had 28 meetings over the course of that period with him, he became increasingly stressed by the macroeconomics. So Kwasniewski and I, out of mission, went to Brussels and spoke with Barroso and spoke with Van Rompuy and said that this was really an urgent item. Europe lacks agility in dealing with things like this, and the International Monetary Fund has conditionality, of which market prices for energy was the key condition. And Yanukovych felt he would lose the presidential election of 2014, which he planned or thought he could win, which is why, of course, he put his main competitor, Yulia Tymoshenko, and others in prison to put them on ice. And the IMF route he wouldn't take. A European route lacked agility and nothing was available. And Mr. Putin moved in and gave, I think, the equivalent of 15 billion US dollars on the table to solve the immediate macroeconomic crisis. And of course, in the politics in that region, we don't know what was under the table. We just know what was on the table. And Yanukovych told me in his office 1 week before the Vilnius summit that he had decided to hit the pause button on the association agreement. And we phoned Stefan Fula in Brussels to tell him that. And 1 week later, we sat in Vilnius when Yanukovych refused to sign. We were observers there. And that, as you say, was the evening when the students went on Maidan. A last comment on Maidan. You're correct. The Berkut attack on students brought others out in sympathy. The other thing that Yanukovych was betting on was that Maidan would run out of steam because you have the Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January and that everybody would go home for Christmas. It didn't happen. And the other thing he relied on was a severely cold winter where the temperatures in Kiev were hitting minus 20. Neither the cold nor the Christmas stopped Maidan. Whether there were other people mixed in it or not, one thing should not be misunderstood. Maidan captured and revealed a popular Ukrainian opinion. When you see families, and in particular when you're bringing your grandmother and your grandfather to a protest, I'm afraid it becomes too reductionist to blame it on the CIA or Nazi coup d'etat and so on. Rather like Solidarność in Poland, when the grannies show up, it means there's something real happening in the host society, and there's no point in excessively externalizing assumptions about what happened. And immediately when Yanukovych fled, I'm sure with great consultation with the Kremlin in advance, immediately Maidan was described as a neo-Nazi coup d'etat. And that has become the first justification of the special military operation and all the things that happened before. So there's a lot tied up in it, but we missed a trick as Europeans by doing what we always do in foreign policy, lacking agility when it counts.
Somebody will react to this.
No, I precisely agree. The fact is that we have to take into consideration the original level of Ukrainian protest. Yes, that's correct. We cannot avoid the fact if we wanted to try to find out the general framework that other, let's say, states has an interest in it. The question is that also Ukraine being a regional partner, a specific state, I didn't had the time to underline it, as a specific kind of politics. Yanukovych, yes, but the question is that oligarchs are in Ukraine as well. The kind of system of corruptions, here's another problems, let's say, in Ukraine. If you have time, I would like to suggest you to look at the movie, not the movie, but the series, The Servant of the People with Zelensky, that is the main character, and that's itself. It has... It gives the general idea of the Ukrainian politics problem. Then, obviously, we are concentrating on Ukraine, and we can analyze the political problem of Ukraine a bit. Probably in other states, there are the same political, let's say, problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the speech, the question. And now we have a break. Thank you. After the round table.
to the final part of this colloquium. We are having a round table with our very distinguished guests. I'm very happy to have you all here today. Just to do the introductions in case you don't know them already. So this roundtable will have for theme the future of Europe, actors, risks, and opportunities. We have Joachim Bitterlich, who's the former ambassador, former European diplomacy and security policy advisor to the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and he's also a professor at the ESCP, Business School of Paris. We have Pat Cox, who is our president, but also the former president of the European Parliament. We have Sylvie Matelli, right there, and she's the director of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. She's also a member of our scientific committee. We have Viviane Reding, right there, former vice president of the European Commission. We have Klaus Regling, can see right there in the middle, former managing director of the European Stability Mechanism. And finally, we have an animation by Chantal Taux, right there. And she's a journalist and also vice president of the new European Movement for Switzerland. Thank you very much and enjoy the roundtable.
Merci beaucoup, Lucie. Alors, je vais m'adonner à une tâche très difficile, mesdames et messieurs. Je vais essayer en 3 minutes de résumer un petit peu les discussions d'hier et celles de ce matin par rapport évidemment au thème du colloque. Donc, ce qu'on a entendu hier, notamment dans la bouche de Gilles Grain, le directeur de l'Institut, c'est que finalement, les hommes et les femmes déterminés dans le processus de décision, ça compte. De même que de disposer d'un livre blanc, d'un catalogue d'idées et de propositions, c'est aussi très utile pour avancer. On a compris également l'importance des réseaux et aussi des réseaux qui ont peut-être une certaine permanence, de la continuité. Et puis, on a saisi évidemment l'importance du sens du compromis et de l'intérêt général. Ça va sans dire, mais apparemment, ça ne va pas toujours aussi facilement qu'on pourrait le penser. Alors, avant de donner la parole aux 5 intervenants pour des propos liminaires, j'aimerais un peu lancer la discussion qui va suivre avec finalement cette idée de livre blanc et de catalogue d'idées pour avancer. On a désormais sur la table, en ce début de nouvelle mandature pour la Commission européenne, le rapport Draghi, le rapport Letta, et on peut se dire qu'il y a matière à un livre blanc. Il y a des enjeux financiers qui sont extraordinaires. L'homme du quoi qu'il en coûte nous dit qu'il faudrait finalement pouvoir investir à hauteur de 800 milliards d'euros par an. Je me réjouis d'entendre Monsieur Regling sur ce point précis. Et donc, voilà. Est-ce que finalement, dans ce contexte, est-ce qu'on est bien outillé pour avancer? Parce que ce qu'on a compris hier, c'est que à 6, c'était plus simple d'avancer qu'à 27. Mais à 27, quand il y a une crise, on arrive quand même à décider, comme on l'a vu avec les fonds de relance post-Covid. Ladies first, je vais commencer par donner la parole pour quelques propos liminaires à Madame Reding, ancienne vice-présidente de la Commission européenne, luxembourgeoise, personnalité bien connue dans les milieux européens avec un très beau parcours.
Thank you so much, and as has been said very clearly, Europe advances in small steps, very small steps sometimes. But if there is a crisis, it can go out of its boundaries and take decisions very quickly. We have seen it with the COVID crisis, where even if Europe has no competence on the matter, it has managed to bring us out of the crisis. We have seen it also with the war in Ukraine. Europe has no competence in security, but it managed to put everybody together in order to go into one direction. Now, if we want to know in which direction we can go, we have, of course, to know the past. And when you look at the past, I think that is very impressive. We came after the Second World War together and said, never more any war. We are going to build peace. We are going to build well-being. Well, we managed inside of Europe to bring the war goers together to build peace, and we built a multicultural, multi-political ensemble which can act as a whole. So it is a real success story which concentrates on well-being. 60% of the budget is allocated to more or less social affairs. And we were lying back because things went so well. So relying on cheap security from the USA, on cheap energy from Russia, and on cheap manufacturing from China. Okay, until we were confronted with the problem that we were not self-sufficient and we didn't have a lot of friends around of us. So what do we need to do? And I think everybody agrees, we need to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, to coordinate and build synergies in defense investment and industry building. It's very interesting to see that most of the arms we are delivering to Ukraine, we buy them first in the United States. Doesn't make sense at all. And we have to win in efficiency and capacity of the armed forces. We are only in our capacity 15% of the capacity of the United States. Doesn't make sense, so we really have to change there, and we're going to change. You might have seen that Ursula von der Leyen has proposed to have a commissioner for defense and for space. Interesting to bring defense and space together, but that will be another debate. The same has to be done for the European pillar of industry and economic sovereignty. In a nutshell, when I make the analysis, technology is going to be the backbone of security, industry, economic development. Europe is very good in several elements, but unexisting in others. And Europe has to decide, is it going to be a standard maker or a standard taker? Is it going to be a technology maker or a technology buyer? And from this will depend all its future, be it in well-being, in social affairs, in security, in economy, or whatever. So, good news. We are good in research. We are good in talent producing. We are good in setting up young, promising startups. And then we stop. Then the problem starts. We don't manage to put our promises into facts. I'll give you some examples. Digital platforms. Europe has 4 out of worldwide 50. Cloud markets. Europe has 15% worldwide. AI developments. 75% of the foundational models are in US, 15% in China. I don't need to say what's in Europe. From the 150 big tech companies we managed to create between 2008 and 2021, 40 left Europe in order to install themselves in the United States. Why? Because we lack private investment, because we lack venture capital. And not because the money is not there in Europe, but per year 300 billion of European money goes into the United States bond market. So instead of being invested in Europe, the money is invested elsewhere. So I give you other examples. The risk capital, I don't speak about subsidies and things like that. I speak about where the real money is coming from and where you can build industries. Risk capital for AI between 21 and 23, the United States 80 billion, China 30 billion, EU 12 billion. Venture capital investment in Europe is 10%, 10 times higher in the US than in Europe. And the result is very clear. We cannot compete, and that is why I hope that this Commission is finally going to do what the Commission of Jean-Claude Juncker proposed in 2015, which is on the table and which Letta and Draghi asked for, a capital market union, in order to allow private investment to flourish and investment to take place. And speaking about Letta and Draghi, I would like to say it's not only the capital, it's also how do we utilize the single market. The single market is our big wealth. Why then go to fragmentation? Why then go back to regionalism? Why then go to Kleinstaaterei, as you say it in Germany, small, small? I will give you a very clear example for what we need to do in the future, and that will be my last example. Instead of investing into knowledge, giving that to other continents, and then trying to build it back, we should keep the knowledge, research, talent in Europe. Quantum computing will be trailblazing in the next 2 or 3 years. It will be the basis, the infrastructure basis for all technological development in the world. Europe is leading. We have most experts worldwide in talent. We are the second worldwide in international patent families. But the 5 biggest industries are in the United States, and the 4 next industries are in China. And we have in Europe a company which knows to build quantum computers and which is selling quantum computers. We could, if we would put the effort on this company, make a European champion and a world champion. But the mentality is missing to do it. So what the next Commission, the next Council, and the next Parliament have to do is to bring back the mentality of the leaders and not of the followers.
Thank you, Ms. Reding. J'aimerais maintenant donner la parole à Sylvie Matelli, directrice de l'Institut Jacques Delors à Paris.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing that conference and inviting me. Well, as in the Draghi, that will only be preliminary remarks, and I think we will discuss after during the debate. As in the Letta and Draghi reports, we always compare the EU to the US. I wanted to do that comparison too. First of all, I think that after 2008, after the crisis, the US and the US administration understood that the main challenges in the few years will be China. And then all the strategy and all policies were oriented to fight against China power and to limit the possibility for China to become the first power in the world in the future. Then if you think about and data are important in that field. If you think about the Obama recovery plan, it was 400 billion. Can you see? It is pretty close from the evaluation of Draghi. We lost some time, and it is the double, but it is the same kind of amount. Then 400 billion for the recovery plan, and mostly to invest in energy and gas shale. Then and the idea was to reduce the gap between production costs, in the production costs between China and the US. Just after that, we had seen a lot of, I would call that counter-political, counter-cyclical policies, when the US and US administration invest a lot in sort of recovery policy while the growth were there. And that's really interesting. That was the tax cut from Trump. And after that was the huge investment in infrastructure from Biden just after the COVID period. And since the US economy recovery only in 10 months. Then they spend a lot. They invest a lot, probably sooner than us. Consequently, first, after 2008 and to the COVID period, the USA has known the longest period of growth in its economic history. Second consequences, the decline of the Chinese growth. You may understand then during the COVID, we may remember that during the COVID period, US invest around 25% of their GDP in the economy, that public investment in the economy. During that time in Europe, we did a lot too. In 2010, we adopt new policies to fight the euro crisis. After 2014, it was the invasion of Crimea by Russia, and we invest in defense, and we begin to think about investing more in defense. In 2016, it was the Brexit and Trump. In 2020, the COVID. In 2022, war in Ukraine. After all that crisis, we took initiatives. We invest in new projects, in new instruments. But the main difference probably with the US is that at the end, we did in reaction of the crisis. Well, we are in the Fondation Jean Monnet. Then we know that Europe will exist because of crisis and will be the sum of the reaction of that crisis. But at the end, even if we did a lot, even if in reality we invest a lot, we invest in, I would say, fragmented policies, and probably in policies that are not coherent and not supporting a strategy. And I think what we have to do today, and what we have to do in the future, and that's the main, I think that's the main conclusion of the Letta Draghi report, but also about the organization of the new commission and the strategic agenda of that new commission. We need now to think about why we want to invest more. Because when you, I call that on my paper this sort of millefeuille of initiatives. When you do that, you create a lot of opportunities for fragmentations. Just think about the example of state aids. During the COVID period, we allowed states to support their economy, to support their companies because of the COVID and the COVID consequences. But at the end, the big countries did a lot and invest a lot. And I think this is one cause of the fragmentation we can see today on the single market. Then we have to think about that strategy. And when you think about a strategy, you have to define what do you want. We are today in a world where, because the US and China are trying to keep the advantage in the world economy, states invest a lot in the economy. That's a reality. And we have to find a way to react to that and to support the European interest. But in the same time, I said that, I think most of the Europeans will agree with that. But in the same time, we want to preserve nation and national interest. We never had two main countries in Europe, France and Germany, as weak as they are today. We are still strongly divided about the recipe to improve the EU. Is it free trade policy or economic security? Is it competition or industrial policy? Do we have to support consumer by reducing prices and promote competition, or social policies? Do we have to reduce our public debt or to invest more in the future? Even if you think about sovereignty, we all agree that we all agree today, and that's, I think, a good thing about Europe, need to improve more and need to invest in sovereignty. But what kind of sovereignty? Against or with the US? With China or against China? That's really difficult, and we are really divided on that topic. And I hope that a white paper will begin to answer such questions. But I think it is really important to talk about that questions in the perspective to think about a strategy with clear objectives. And when you have clear objectives, you can find the policy you need to do. But without, you would just take initiative in reaction of crisis, but not a strategy. Thanks a lot.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Matelli. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Pat Cox, notre président de la Fondation Jean Monnet.
Merci beaucoup, Chantal. La première chose que je voudrais dire est de m'excuser pour mon absence hier, qui était à cause d'une force majeure, des orages à Londres qui m'a bloqué, qui ont retardé et finalement annulé les vols que j'ai prévus le jour en avant. J'aimerais bien remercier personnellement, au nom de la Fondation Jean Monnet, chaque participant ici, aujourd'hui et hier. Nous sommes très honorés avec votre présence et merci beaucoup pour cela. Et surtout, un mot de remerciement personnel à Michael Galler, qui a conceptualisé ces journées. Et Michael, merci beaucoup pour cela. Permit me, in terms of what we're discussing, which I find really interesting, perhaps to pick up some of the themes and elaborate. I want to zoom up. We love introspection in the European Union, but we're living in a complex geopolitical environment. The first thing concerning, Chantal, you talked about actors. I think the first key thing I want to mention briefly, but I think it's important, is who will win the US presidential election and who will win a majority in Congress and Senate. If it is Mr. Trump, he will be, predictably, a great disruptor. He will be, predictably, someone who I think risks to undermine Europeans' sense of security by being willing to trade over the head of Ukraine to cut some kind of a deal with Vladimir Putin, if his own words are to be believed. He will be someone who seems to have an endless appetite for imposing tariffs on trade, which is not in our interest, and seems to misunderstand that tariffs are paid by his own citizens in the end, but he projects them as being paid by foreigners. We would lose output, but we wouldn't be paying the tariff. Our price would be the loss of output. All of these things are there, and who knows what else. I think should he return, he will have less guardrails in terms of checks and balances to do with law and potentially Congress than any president in modern history in the United States. If, on the other hand, Kamala Harris wins, I think Europe will breathe a sigh of relief. It doesn't mean that all of our issues have gone away. It's just that she is more sympathetic to some of the traditional alliances and perspectives on which Europe has relied. But expect her to be the president asserting the interests of the United States, but I think more user-friendly from a European point of view. It's very clear that that election is almost impossible to call. I follow assiduously the various polls. We know that the critical issue because of this electoral college is not just winning the popular vote, but winning the electoral college. The magic number is to arrive at 270 electoral college votes, and the routes are through 4 Midwestern states and 3 Southern states. And they are all within the margin of error of the polling that has been done. Trump is ahead in 3 the last time I looked. Harris is ahead in 4, but they're all within the margin of error. So this is a too close to call election. I'm shocked by it with someone like Trump that he's still so eminently fixed to be a potential president again, but there it is. What I would like to do then in that context is to look in a way at some of the elements that I think have brought about Trump as a response to other underlying conditions. If we step back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, the United States had its unilateral moment of power. And in that unilateral moment, its biggest shock, I would say, was the 9/11, September of 2001. And the response was to declare a war on terror. For the first time, Article 5 of NATO was invoked. Le Monde said, "Nous sommes tous des Américains." So, everyone was together in a sense. But in choosing to have this ambition of bringing democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, it ended up in the sand, like so many imperial or neo-imperial postures in that region over long periods of time. And so that bit didn't work and left the United States feeling diminished. The second thing was the extraordinary pile of bad debt that was built up in the United States that led to the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 and eventually to all of the economic crisis and our Eurozone crisis and so on here in Europe. I think what that established was that the appetite for deregulation, which had been so powerful, had gone too far, and it was time for the pendulum in the USA to swing back somewhat. A third dimension I would pick is at the level of world trade. In his very last speech, State of the Union speech in 2002, Bill Clinton talked about China joining the WTO as being good for Americans and good for China. In his inaugural address in January 2017, Trump talked about American carnage. And the two presidents in the two speeches were talking about the same thing, about trade and what its presumed effect was. Now, in picking those bits of political rhetoric, I realize there's a lot more underneath. But the reason I go to this is because I think if we're locating Europe and strategy, we have been big beneficiaries of what I would call predictable multilateralism and strong multilateral institutions over many years. We live in a multipolar world, and if we are coherent, we as Europeans can speak in a coherent space in that multilateral world, in that multipolar world. But multilateralism as we knew it is now under threat. So we have the coexistence of multipolarity with contested multilateralism. And this gives us a trickier foreign policy strategic challenge than before. So my sense that Kaja Kallas, who will take on now the foreign policy role and who will be strong on Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia and so on, because she's of course a former Prime Minister of Estonia, or Andrius Kubilius, I think it was Vivian mentioned the defence policy, he's a former Prime Minister of Lithuania. So I think they're going to be, so far as the system will permit them, to be strong advocates for change. But we need in Europe to contemplate wider issues of foreign policy. How do we locate ourselves in this multipolar world with contested multilateralism? And here I think no matter who is the US president, we have a real challenge. Because it is quite clear, and it has been said here already twice, that you have between America and China now a great power rivalry. And we are in the middle. And we have relations with both sides in different degrees and, of course, with very different histories. And the more we rely, in particular, on American security guarantees for Europe, which we're happy to have and which we want to sustain with a stronger Euro pillar inside NATO, or in parallel with NATO, not in competition with NATO, the more I believe we are constrained about how we play the other game. Because you can't look for the guarantees on one side from the USA and tell them, and forgive the unparliamentary language, but tell them to piss off when it comes to issues of trade or economic security. So I think Europe has a delicate balance. And I think we need, as we look at foreign policy, to think through a strategy which is more subtle than before. The other dimension I think that I would add on this foreign policy perspective is we should not write off, and I know it's a kind of a phrase that we use that is a bit loose in definitional terms, we should not write off the global south. The global south is non-West, but the global south is not ipso facto anti-West. And we've got to get better at finding and building partnerships with the non-West but not anti-West global south. And we haven't been great at that so far. And a lot of them see us as hectoring and lecturing and paternalistic and knowing best. So we need a new narrative and a new language of engagement to be able to optimize. Why? Because if we have a good single market, if we get all of that together, we need access to markets and we need partnerships that allow us to thrive and grow and develop. And let us understand this. In the past, it was true, and one of the great elements of Western democracy and what I'd call post-war multilateralism was that the democracies were growing and thriving and the other places weren't working. Whether we like it or not now to do with systems, China is an advanced economy and has made extraordinary progress. Or at the other end of the size scale, Singapore has been extraordinary. So if you're in the market of shopping for development models, there's the Western democratic one, but there's also other more autocratic ones. So it's a much more diverse play on that front. The second and last thing I want to touch on briefly about Letta, Draghi, new commission and strategy and so on. Many of you will know, and certainly those who are in European affairs, the work that was done by Pierre Werner in 1969, promulgating the idea of a single currency, of economic and monetary union. That got trapped by the consequences of the Yom Kippur War, and so it never happened in the timescale foreseen. But nonetheless, a lot of work happened, and one of them was a report chaired by a Brit, MacDougall, looking at the question of financing the then European Economic Community. And what he talked about was the need for a level of pre-federal finance. He was looking at something like 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP. Now, we've never got there. As we know, the sum of the willingness of all of the member states lodges somewhere around 1% of GDP as the scale of the EU budget. The one breach in that system was the Resilience and Recovery Programme and the willingness to allow the European Union to collateralise the borrowing through EU and to pay back through the EU budget. And now we're at a real moment of definition to do with EU's spending capacity over the coming period. If the rule was you borrowed the money, we give you the 1% limit on your budget, and now you must start paying back, it will be less than 1% to do all the things you want to do. Or alternatively, you roll over the debt some way, or you look at some of these mechanisms. And I would be very interested in particular to hear Klaus Regling's sense of what are the possibilities. The politics of this is always complicated, but what are the possibilities? If we don't do that, Europe will not have a great budgetary capacity to step forward to this strategic future of which we speak. And in that context, this issue, and it really rests with member states and capital cities and national parliaments, do we really want Europe, and are we prepared to invest in our own Europe? And that is my question to do with the money question. So between foreign policy strategy and money issues, this isn't in the bag. It's not a done deal, and we've a lot of homework still to do. Thank you for your attention.
And now, Klaus Regling, you have the floor.
I just got my question then.
And you have the question, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's easy to be pessimistic about Europe today. The geopolitics are awful. There are wars around us. Europe is squeezed between the two superpowers, China and United States. Globalization as such was wonderful for Europe because it was very compatible with the way we in Europe are organized. The EU is the best model for multilateralism, and it really works. And Europe is the most open economy. But globalization has come to an end. We see now deglobalization. Also, of course, we are all aware that the EU has grown tremendously. When I went first to Brussels in the early 80s, there were 8 countries around the table. Then there were 28 at one point. We are back to 27. But probably over the next decades, there will be 35 countries. And that in itself makes it more difficult to work and to come to quick results. Also, nationalism is back in many countries, to a large extent triggered by migration. We heard about that earlier today. And the leaders of the past, who we often admire because they had a strong vision of what to do, they were influenced very much by World War II and some even World War I. They are gone. It's good that we didn't have wars the past few decades, but the leaders today are different from the old leaders. As I said, there are many reasons to be pessimistic about Europe. Also, we talked about yesterday the traditional models that France and Germany takes the leadership on issues, work well together and others follow, doesn't work today because the leaders don't agree often. And also it's not as easy as it used to be, given that we are 27 countries, where other countries will not easily accept such leadership, which doesn't exist at the moment. So easy to be pessimistic. But looking back, Europe has come a long way. And I've experienced this often, that when you are in the middle of a crisis, you are desperate because Europe is moving so slowly. But when you look back, things have actually happened quite quickly sometimes, particularly, as Viviane Reding said, in a crisis. Normally, the EU moves very, very slowly, but in a crisis, one can jump. And we have seen that many times. In the early 80s, everybody was talking about Eurosclerosis. Then Delors came and created the single market and started the way to the monetary union. The global financial crisis, 2008, affected many countries around the world, also Europe. But we did lots of things in response to that crisis. And remember, early last year, there were several US banks who got into trouble. Also, Credit Suisse, second largest bank in Switzerland, had to be taken over by UBS. In the EU, we had no problem. There was no banking problem in this very similar environment where interest rates started rising again. The euro crisis, where I spent a lot of energy, looked really bad. There was a real risk that the euro area would shrink. I don't think the euro would disappear like the Anglo-Saxons thought, many of them, but there was a real risk that 2 or 3 countries would have to leave. If that had happened, I think Europe would be in a different shape today, much, much weaker. That was avoided, and not only was it avoided, but I think after some years today, it's clear that the way we dealt with the euro crisis was a big success, because the 5 countries that needed money from European partners, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Cyprus, they all have a better economic performance today than all other European countries. Corona, we had talked yesterday about Next Generation EU. That year, 2020, was a very difficult year for many countries around the world. GDP dropped by the biggest amount in decades. The Next Generation EU package was completely innovative and does a lot of good in southern European countries. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it was a big, big step in response to Corona. So I think we have demonstrated during crisis that we can act. The circumstances may be more difficult. We lack leadership. We have difficult geopolitical environment. Deglobalization doesn't help our economic performance. Cooperation between major countries is not good. But this can change again. And my hope is that it could change under the impression of what's happening around us. The geopolitics, the wars. If Trump becomes president again, and as Pat Cox says, he is a disruptor, then Europe should realize that it has to get its act together and integrate more. And the experts know what needs to be done. You can all read it in the Letter and Draghi report, and there are many others. And you don't have to agree on everything. The question of more European debt is a very small one. Unfortunately, the German establishment jumped at that, but that's totally inadequate. There are many good ideas there. We have European public goods that need to be increased. On defense, that was mentioned, on climate change, on border controls. And I think one can build a case, that was Pat's question in the end, on having a bigger EU budget. One has to explain it to the frugal countries that this means shifting responsibilities from the national level to the European level. So expenditures that so far are done at the national level can be more efficiently used at the EU level, for instance, on defense, where we have today 20 procurement systems. If it were done at the EU level for the same amount of money, one can get much more out of it. So it's more productive. It does not mean more public expenditures. It's just shifting from the national to the EU level. It does not increase the share of the public sector in GDP. It does not increase the fiscal deficit overall. So it's just using the money more efficiently. And I think one has to explain that to the public. And that's one way to have a larger EU budget, which I think is unavoidable. Yeah. Let me end here.
Thank you, Mr. Wrigley. And maintenant pour 5 minutes, Joachim Bitterlich. C'est à vous. Attention.
Thank you very much. It's strange. It's true. It's easy to be pessimistic today. But what we need, what is another spirit? Really another spirit among Europeans. Otherwise, we are about to lose our future. And it's so strange for me that we are totally, what I call, in a defensive position in any area. We are not setting the agenda. Instead of, let's say, being aware and conscious about the reality, we are renationalizing policies or responses. At the same time, we know exactly that the only way for the Europeans is to act together on the side. Therefore, in order to rebuild what I call confidence of our citizens, confidence of our economic actors, confidence in research, what we need is what I call agenda setting. And what I would like to say is, please, let's concentrate on 4 areas in Europe. And I would like not to deepen the aspects of European industrial policy. We are losing industrial policy. We are losing industry. Look at the situation of car industry. Look at the situation of high-tech in Europe. Strategic autonomy is for me the catchword. Strategic autonomy with regard to the US, with regard to China. And insofar, I'm speaking about research. Why the hell research in Europe is so, let's say, stick to classical bureaucratic schemes? Why we are so risk-averse in Europe? I'm part of an initiative created 3 years ago in Paris, JEDI called, Disruptive Innovation in Europe. We are blocked by the research community in Europe, by the Max Planck, by the Fraunhofer, the CNRS and others, who stick to their budgets, who stick to their classical, let's say, approach with regard to research. We have proposed to take the American approach of 1958. After the Sputnik, the Americans launched the DARPA. We have asked for the same story in Europe in order to revamp research, in order to reduce our distance towards China and towards the US. Up till now, we are blocked on this. No one has up till now the courage, let's say, to say, stop, let's be less risk-averse, let's concentrate on real technological areas in Europe to revamp European research in these fields. Second subject, I mentioned it yesterday, security and migration. A key subject for the Europeans, internal security plus migration. We dream about, let's say, the Canadian or the Australian solution. It's perfectly possible to do so. It's not even difficult, but we are there in this area where everyone looks at its national areas without understanding what's at stake. Third area, security and defense. Yes, we need a certain new transatlantic agenda. Yes, it has to do with foreign policy, it has to do with security. It's for me It's useless to reflect about who will be the next American president. It's not we are electing the president, it's the Americans. And we have to accept who will be in power in the US. It will be either Trump or Harris. Both will be difficult with us. Please, Europeans, wake up at the end. I've been asking European industry, please formulate what's, in your view, the future transatlantic agenda. What are the main points of this in trade, in investment, in taxation, etc., including defense? How we realize what I call 3% GDP for defense. That's the key, not 2%, forget about it. 3. 3 is the subject. How we are able to put this into music. And the last one, foreign policy. Foreign policy, there's the absence of a European foreign policy. I regret. We have no common foreign policy. It was the wrong approach in my eyes. Please, let's concentrate on what's essential. Essential first, there is the relationship with the US. Yes, it's clear. The Global South, Pat Cox, yes. Even if this Global South is not unified, is not existing. It's reality. We have missed this point. Where are we? Nowhere. And the third one is, after mentioning the subject, well, we have not really touching it. It's EU enlargement. How to consolidate our bases in Europe. How to integrate the Balkans. I know exactly that the majority of capitals are not ready to integrate and to ratify the enlargement treaty with the 6 Balkan countries. Please, dear friends, there are alternative solutions. We have not to reinvent them, but we have to do it at the end of the day, because our security, our future is there. And if we are not able to integrate Europe as a whole, please, Europe will be at its end. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, ambassadeur Peter Lich. Maintenant, en principe, on devait permettre aux participants à cette table ronde de se répondre mutuellement, mais leur tourne. Alors, j'aimerais essayer de faire le lien entre ces enjeux, ces défis que vous avez tous posés. On est à un moment de wake-up call, hein, vous l'avez dit à plusieurs reprises, et compte tenu de l'expérience que vous avez les uns et les autres dans les institutions européennes, alors comment on va arriver à cette coordination, cette convergence? Finalement, est-ce que tout va venir de la Commission? Est-ce que c'est le Conseil européen? On a parlé des chercheurs. Est-ce que finalement les réseaux de chercheurs ou les réseaux d'industriels ne doivent pas être mieux informés et coordonnés? Finalement, si l'heure est grave, comment on va arriver à cette volonté générale? Qui doit prendre un peu l'initiative? Je ne sais pas, Monsieur Regling, Monsieur Cox, Madame Reding, Monsieur Bitterlich, qui veut répondre?
Je vais commencer brièvement. L'Europe a une triple dimension en decision-making. Et les trois doivent se coordonner pour arriver à une décision. Les seuls qui proposent, c'est la Commission. Donc, une forte Commission, et vous avez peut-être remarqué que dernièrement, la Commission a un peu changé d'un modèle transversal vers un modèle pyramidal. Ce qui, en temps de crise, est une bonne chose, à mon avis. On peut en discuter, mais moi, je parle toujours de l'efficacité. Hein, pour ne pas aller dans tous les sens. Et je suis d'accord avec tous ceux qui disent que le grand problème, ce sont les États membres. parce que en fait, le nationalisme et le moi-je et mes petits champions régionaux prennent le dessus sur l'intérêt général. Parce que l'intérêt général, qui est européen, parce que nous sommes en concurrence avec la Chine, les États-Unis et demain l'Inde, et pas entre le Luxembourg et les États-Unis et l'Inde, n'est-ce pas? Donc, c'est très clair, nous pouvons seulement gagner si nous éliminons la fragmentation. Les deux institutions qui luttent pour éliminer la fragmentation sont la Commission européenne et le Parlement. Et ceux qui sont un problème sont les États membres. En ce qui concerne la recherche, je voudrais quand même être un peu moins négative parce que on a un joyau de la recherche mondiale qu'est le programme Horizon. Et le monde entier essaye de faire partie du programme Horizon. Et j'ai donné quelques exemples aussi où nous sommes world leading en matière de recherche. Nous le sommes. Et j'étais responsable pendant 5 ans quand même de la recherche technologique en Europe, donc je connais un tout petit peu. Et je vous dis, on est bon. Mais les effets de la recherche, on les perd. C'est ça que j'ai essayé de vouloir expliquer. Parce que quand on met la recherche dans la commercialisation, dans l'industrialisation, on perd. Et là où il y a une différence entre nous et les Américains, c'est pas la recherche publique, mais c'est la recherche privée. Les Américains, ils investissent beaucoup plus dans la recherche privée et ils investissent beaucoup plus dans l'investissement privé. C'est ce que j'avais essayé de dire aussi dans ma présentation.
Merci Viviane Reding. Je crois que Pat Cox veut répondre.
I'm just going to, I mean, there are lots of things. I'm encouraged, I must say, by the positive response of Klaus Regling on the budget question. I mean, we can do this. We need political will to do it. I think we do have a struggle with German ordo-liberalism on this front, and it's of all governments of Germany, and then complicated if the government itself finds it difficult to find consensus. But I want to turn to the disruptive innovation thing. I think it's a really interesting point. You have really the two things. You spend money on invention, and you make money through innovation. And if we're talking about innovation policy, a good deal of the focus of the research needs to be market-led, because you're going to sell it to someone in the end. And I would make an observation, and to go from the particular to the general, you know, I'm cautious about, but I do lots of things, and among them, I chair 2 innovative companies on the front of sustainability. One of them looking at new grid system transmission mechanisms, and one of them today on the market with low carbon cement, not in 2035, but today. And the observation I want to make is there's a European Innovation Fund, and both of those companies wanted to do scale up and applied. But the Innovation Fund recycles the money from steel and cement, let's call it in CO2 terms, dirty industry for the purpose of illustration. It takes the money in a carbon tax and it recycles to the dirty industry to clean up through carbon capture or whatever. And if you're clean tech, although it's an innovation fund, it doesn't actually apply. So the point I do want to make, I think there are, I'm not making special pleading here, we need to look at, does innovation matter? We need to look at market-led research if we want to lead. I don't have a problem with blue sky pure research. That's a great strength of European academia. But if we want to make money, we've got to turn innovation into product, and that means we relate what we do to markets and marketability and route to market.
And finance.
Indeed, but private finance comes forward with these things. The things I'm talking about have not had 1 cent of public finance, but they're already good to go through private finance. And the issue of having enough European finance is not that Europe pays, it gives a small incentive to crowd in private finance. That's the critical issue.
Alors, une petite réponse de Madame Nathalie, ensuite je donne la parole à Joachim Batterlich.
Oh, c'est pas c'est une réaction à ce que je viens d'entendre et ça vient compléter ce que je viens d'entendre. Je crois que au cœur du sujet, et vous venez de le dire, Monsieur Cox, on a quand même la question de l'argent et des investissements. C'est vrai que l'investissement public entraîne par effet de levier de l'investissement privé, mais aujourd'hui, le marché, et vous l'avez dit, Madame Reding, les marchés financiers sont fragmentés en Europe, et par conséquent, on est en compétition par rapport à ça. Je crois qu'il y a un élément, quand on regarde ce qu'on est en train de vivre à l'extérieur de l'Union européenne, tout ce contexte géopolitique. Dans ce contexte géopolitique, il y a une confrontation Chine-États-Unis, on l'a tous dit. Et cette confrontation Chine-États-Unis, elle me fait étrangement penser à ce qu'on a connu pendant la guerre froide entre la Russie et les États-Unis, qui était une course aux armements. On n'est plus dans une course aux armements, on est dans une course aux armements. Mais au-delà de cette course aux armements, ce qu'on observe, c'est une sorte de course aux investissements en réalité. C'est-à-dire, j'investis, ça a été les routes de la soie pour la Chine, ça a été ensuite d'autres projets américains, dont l'IRA, etc., etc. Donc on a l'impression qu'on est dans cette course aux armements. Dans le cas de la Chine et des États-Unis, l'enjeu est très clair. C'est de garder le leadership mondial. Nous ne sommes pas dans cette logique-là. Nous ne voulons pas, et nous avons des intérêts à garder des relations aussi approprié, je vais utiliser ce terme-là, que possible avec la Chine et avec les États-Unis. Il n'empêche que nous sommes confrontés à cette course aux investissements et que même si nous sommes bons sur des tas de choses, nous devons trouver un moyen de relancer les investissements européens. L'investissement public, pourquoi pas ? Ça me semble compliqué, mais peut-être que, comme vous le disiez, Madame Reding, la priorité des priorités, c'est cette union des marchés des capitaux pour enfin recycler l'épargne européenne en Europe. Et là, on aura de l'investissement privé, et on aura un investissement privé, encore une fois, dont il faudra veiller, qu'il ne conduise pas à produire de nouvelles fragmentations, puisque chaque initiative a eu plutôt tendance ces dernières années à produire des fragmentations parce qu'il n'y avait pas cette dimension stratégique derrière. Où veut-on aller ? Aujourd'hui, on réagit à un environnement. Où veut-on réellement aller ? Que veut-on construire ? L'Europe de demain, l'Europe du futur, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire ? Et là-dessus, je pense qu'il y a moyen de se mettre d'accord.
Merci. Joachim Batterlich.
Chère Viviane, je n'ai pas dit le contraire. Pour moi, ce qui est la clé, c'est la technologie future dans l'industrie et pour l'industrie européenne. Market-led research. Là est la clé. Et moi, je parie, l'argent est là en Europe. Sylvie a raison. Il faut essayer de réorienter nos économies qui partent aux États-Unis. Il faudrait les investir en Europe, oui. Mais de l'autre côté, pour moi, les États pourraient montrer ce qu'on appelle le bon exemple à cet égard. Nous avons une BEI, nous avons des banques nationales qui pourraient aider à cet égard. La Caisse des dépôts, la KfW en Allemagne, le modèle italien, etc. Et j'ai fait avec Enrico Letta le calcul que ça pourrait nous apporter entre 2 et 400 milliards par an s'ils étaient obligés, ces banques, de diriger l'investissement pour nos technologies de futur de pointe. Je vous donne un exemple bête et simple. J'ai écouté dernièrement un des spécialistes allemands pour ce que j'appelle les technologies du futur. Nous essayons depuis maintenant, je pense 4 ans, de monter un European Cloud. Vous avez entendu de cette histoire. C'est toujours pas de réalité. On dépend des Américains à cet égard et de plus en plus des Chinois. On est incapable parce que les Européens ont peur de la réaction des GAFA et des Chinois. On ne le fait pas. On est absent dans le 6G, dans le 7G pour la téléphonie du futur. Ce sont les Chinois, c'est Huawei, hein, ce sont les Américains, mais ce ne sont plus les Européens. Pourquoi nous ne sommes pas capables de prendre l'argent dans la main, comme les Américains l'ont fait avec la DARPA, et de concentrer nos efforts publics et ensuite privés, oui, capital public et privé, dans ces technologies de pointe dans les années à venir pour l'Europe. C'est pour moi la question que je pose. Et ça, c'est la clé. Et là, je vois une chose, c'est, on me dit toujours, l'Européen est risk averse. L'Européen n'est pas le risque. Et c'est pour ça, on vit dans des termes budgétaires. On préfère avoir chaque année 2% de plus, au lieu de dire, j'ai risque l'argent. Mais ça, on ne le fait pas. On a peur de ça. Et je ne sais pas pourquoi. Parce qu'on est parfaitement capable si on prenait notre destin en main.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois qu'on va prendre quelques questions du public. Levez la main, autrement moi j'en ai d'autres. Je crois que je peux donner la parole ici devant.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations. I'm personally involved in different China programs, and China is an issue which has been mentioned here very much. I'm actually involved in a program, research program, which is financed by the European Commission. It's called Reconnect China. And the question we have got is, are there still possibilities, or what are the possibilities, what are the opportunities for still working together with China? Are there still possibilities? And that's, of course, a difficult question and difficult to answer also for us. Of course, the European Union has come with all kinds of keywords, like a strategic partner, economic competitor, systemic rival. De-risking is another topic which has been mentioned a lot. But what does it mean? What can we still do? We heard today in the panel that some talked about protective multilateralism, another about strategic autonomy. But what does it mean in terms of working together with China? Are there still avenues open for making contact with these countries, or should we totally close ourselves off from the cooperation with China? Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Those ready?
Maybe I can start. Closing off would be suicide. And therefore I think Ursula von der Leyen was very skillful when she coined the expression de-risking instead of the Anglo-Saxon decoupling from China. I think that is the right approach. And I think the US is also moving in that direction. But Europe was first to differentiate between the two, between decoupling, which would mean what you just said, getting out of China, and de-risking. Economic relations with China are just too important. China is today almost 1/5 of the world economy. And we feel it when they slow down even. So to get out of China would not be wise. But of course one has to interact with them in a more assertive way, because they have misused the multilateral trading system to some extent. The trade deficit of Europe, the EU with China is something like 400 billion euro. And that is not fair trade. But I think the Commission is doing that when they go, and also when prime ministers, economic ministers from EU countries go to China, they talk about that much more today than in the past. So China has to move. And I think they also are a bit afraid of losing Europe. They know they are in a struggle with the United States about who is the superpower and number one in the world, and China sees its position as to be number two, like it was up to 200 years ago. So that's between China and the US. So we have to be careful here, but we need fair trade. And then there are certain areas where it really makes sense for both sides to cooperate. Climate change is an obvious topic, because we can only influence climate change if we have a global approach. And again, China is the biggest player here. So that's an area where I think both sides would agree that one should really cooperate also on research to make progress, and there are probably some other areas.
Merci. La
May
parole
I say
oui?
just to work on research? It works? Yeah. Because in order to explain how it works and why it goes to a certain direction, Europe was very strong on telephony. Europe has developed GSM and 4G. America was very strong on digital, and it didn't bother to invest on telephony. Now we had a situation, very strong digital in the United States, very strong telephony in Europe, and both are leaning back. And in the meantime, China profits from our leaning back and develops 5G. Europe was nowhere on it, and America neither on 4G. So now everybody, including America and including Europe, is heavily investing on 6G. That means sometimes we do very big faults because we are simply not concentrating, and we are simply thinking that because we do something right, we do not prepare the future when this something which is right becomes old.
Sylvie Maffeli et ensuite Pat Cox.
Merci. Juste une petite réaction à ce que vous disiez. L'ambassade de France à Washington envoie une fois tous les vendredis soirs une lettre sur la politique commerciale américaine en détaillant tout ce qui s'est passé, tout ce qui se passe à Washington. Et la lettre d'hier soir avait deux nouvelles qui étaient particulièrement intéressantes, et j'ai pas oublié votre question. La première, c'est le fait que les Américains ont un projet pour interdire la circulation de tout véhicule qui contiendrait des composants russes ou chinois, pour des questions de sécurité intérieure, bien évidemment, de contrôle des données, bien évidemment, mais aussi pour des questions économiques et d'intérêt économique bien compris des États-Unis. Premier élément. Et en même temps, la nouvelle suivante, c'était le fait qu'il y a une délégation en ce moment américaine qui est en train de négocier à Pékin sur la coopération économique entre les deux pays. C'est ce qu'on appelle du pragmatisme en réalité. Je crois que la politique de dérisking qui a été mise en œuvre ces dernières années a été relativement pragmatique, et c'est très intéressant effectivement, et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec tout ce que vous avez dit. Et en même temps, on reste quand même dans une certaine difficulté à accepter ce pragmatisme qui parfois nous fait aller dans des décisions qui peuvent être contradictoires. Alors j'ose espérer que ce qu'on appelle dans l'agenda stratégique, dans les lettres de mission qui ont été envoyées à Madame Kaja Kallas ou aux commissaires qui sont en charge du commerce, cette Foreign Economic Policy que je crois que l'on retrouvait déjà dans le rapport Draghi, j'ose espérer que ça nous permettra de gérer ces contradictions avec une politique étrangère, économique, défendant les intérêts des Européens de manière bien comprise et bien articulée. Mais voilà ce que je voulais répondre.
So we've had all the language, reshoring, onshoring, deglobalization, decoupling, and we've settled, and G7 also settled with European leadership on de-risking. And I agree with you, Sylvie. I think it leaves a lot of room for pragmatism and interpretation. I would make a point firstly about private industry and private investments by Europeans or United States or others in China. A well-run company in governance terms will keep a good risk register. And on its risk register, it will identify the degrees of risk associated with particular company policy. And if it's well run, they will have a series of risk mitigants that they identify to minimize the risk. So I would leave de-risking for the private sector largely to the private sector and their risk registers if they're well managed, because they know what they're doing. And I think at the political level, the how would I put it, the constructive ambiguity of the phrase de-risking is politically helpful. And as we all know, anyone who's been involved in politics, there is a strong positive role sometimes for constructive ambiguity in our use of language. Last thing I would say, at the last German presidency, Angela Merkel succeeded in closing out a negotiation, EU-China, on an investment accord. And Joe Biden, some months later, on the Uyghur issue in China, co-opted the EU that shared the human rights values to object to what China was doing. The European Parliament passed a resolution condemning China for its treatment of Uyghurs, and China then blacklisted key senior MEPs in the Parliament from visiting China, including the chair of the China delegation. The consequence was that the Parliament has refused to give its assent, which is required under the Lisbon Treaty, and with no parliamentary assent in the European Parliament, it could not pass, whether it will be controversial or not, for approval by national parliaments. So there was an example of a strategic space put together, which was taken apart by other issues. And these, in a way, are what I was trying to refer to earlier, that when there's a lot of pressure that comes from Washington, D.C. to do with a diplomatic push on a given issue, it's very hard sometimes for European foreign policy to disengage from the momentum. And that's why the accord with China fell victim, at least at this point in time. And it would be interesting to speculate, is Europe still interested in that accord? And could the politics be decoupled by a degree of negotiated rapprochement?
D'autres questions dans le public, monsieur?
Bonjour à toutes et tous, Pierre Tsvalen, député du canton de Vaud. Merci beaucoup pour ce débat. J'en ai été un peu déçu parce que j'ai l'impression qu'on a beaucoup plus parlé de la Chine et des États-Unis que de l'Europe. Est-ce que ce continent ne pourrait pas faire confiance à ses valeurs, en ses talents, pour se développer encore et pour assurer sa prospérité? J'ai peu entendu, malheureusement, parler du Green Deal et de la très belle orientation qu'a prise l'Union européenne ces dernières années et qui est certainement un gisement pour réussir une transition écologique juste et compétitive. C'est d'ailleurs le sens et le nom qui a été donné à l'une des importantes vice-présidentes de la Commission européenne, l'espagnole en l'occurrence, et je pense que c'est certainement là que l'Europe peut faire sa différence sur le plan mondial.
Merci.
Certainement en moins s'occupant de se comparer à la Chine ou aux États-Unis, mais en jouant sa propre voix, qui peut là être un grand succès.
Alors, qui veut répondre parmi les panélistes? Plus de confiance en soi, et puis aussi en la capacité de mener une transition écologique, peut-être de manière plus volontariste que d'autres. Pat Cox?
Just very briefly, I wouldn't like that we should leave the impression here today that people who sit on this platform, who've given the best part of their adult lives to their belief in Europe, is that we lack confidence in it. I think what the debate is about is trying to find the confidence to go forward in what has become an increasingly complex environment. This is not to abandon our confidence, but to orientate it to the challenges. I think you're quite correct that the Green Deal put Europe, as it has often been, as a global regulatory superpower in leadership to do with trying to form a transition. But what we've seen inside the EU, so we have to also observe this, is a good deal of pushback, particularly in agriculture, but not only. We have the issue about electric vehicles and what dates rules should apply and so on. And so in a certain way, if we want to give regulatory signals to the private sector, do we hold the line to orientate strategic investment policies of the private sector, or do we look for wriggle room and backslide? And every time we choose to take a step back from a strategic policy, we give mixed signals, not just to the rest of the world, but to our own producers and industries. And so my hope is that the new Commission and the Spanish Commissioner charged with this will focus on the strategic certainties related to the green transition and the energy transition in order to give to European industrialists and researchers and innovators a clear perspective of what future to expect, first in Europe, and by extension, if it is leadership, potentially elsewhere also.
J'aimerais enchaîner avec une question peut-être pour Sylvie Matelli. En fait, est-ce qu'une des difficultés de l'Union européenne aussi dans ce processus de décision et d'émergence de la volonté générale, c'est qu'en fait, par rapport aux États-Unis ou à la Chine, dans l'Union européenne, on agit en toute transparence. On a vu hier des exemples où les prises de décision ont mûri de manière discrète et confidentielle, comme nous l'a expliqué Klaus Regling, et dans le comité monétaire, les décisions étaient préparées en toute confidentialité. Mais finalement, maintenant, l'Union européenne, elle peut se poser des agendas, des dates butoirs, des livres blancs, mais tout ça est extraordinairement transparent, là où les Chinois ne le sont pas toujours, et là où les Américains sont parfois un peu machiavéliques.
C'est une excellente question. Merci de me l'avoir posée et je réfléchis tout en répondant. Au-delà de la transparence, et c'est ce qui est souvent reproché d'ailleurs par les acteurs privés, les entreprises en particulier, aux institutions européennes, il y a la volonté aussi de porter et de défendre systématiquement ce qui fait l'Europe, c'est-à-dire les valeurs de l'Europe. La transparence en fait partie, mais de la démocratie, et puis sur les questions de pacte vert et de transition vers une économie plus juste, plus solidaire et écologique, eh bien on a vu, moi j'avais suivi ça sur les questions de défense, toutes ces normes qui ont été, ces normes de reporting, de transparence qui ont été imposées aux entreprises et qui, c'est vrai, créent des contraintes qui peuvent à terme, et qui sont, je suis convaincue, à terme, constituent un avantage comparatif et constitueront un avantage comparatif. Je disais ça à une entreprise qui est très présente en Afrique et qui se lamentait à juste titre il y a quelques années parce que une entreprise du bâtiment, parce que quand ils construisaient un pont, le même pont construit par des Chinois ne coûtait pas le même tarif parce qu'il y avait toutes les contraintes de lutte contre la corruption, etc., etc. Mais je lui disais oui, sauf que quand il s'agit d'embaucher de la main-d'œuvre locale, vous attirez les meilleurs, parce que les conditions de travail sont différentes des Chinois. Donc effectivement, on peut capitaliser sur ces aspects-là, et c'est un élément très important, mais à court terme, ça reste malgré tout des contraintes. Alors visiblement, la Commission a décidé de s'y attaquer. Moi, je crains qu'on s'y attaque, mais par le mauvais côté du sujet, c'est-à-dire en essayant de nous rendre aussi moins 10 ans finalement que la Chine. Donc ça, c'était le premier élément de ma réponse. Et puis pour pas être trop long, deuxième élément, je crois qu'il faut aussi bien prendre conscience que quand on décide, on est 27 avec des cultures différentes, des histoires différentes, des perceptions différentes. Encore une fois, je vais revenir sur mes sujets que sont les questions de défense. On est d'accord sur le fait qu'il faut investir plus pour se défendre, mais vous avez d'un côté les pays qui ont des industries d'armement et qui souhaiteraient que l'on mette en tout premier, en haut de l'agenda, la préférence européenne, et on achète d'abord des armements européens. Et puis ceux qui n'ont pas d'industrie de défense, donc pas cet intérêt-là, et qui disent oui, mais avant qu'on puisse fournir en européen, il va falloir 20 ans et des programmes en commun, etc., etc. Donc finalement, autant acheter aux Américains, aux Sud-Coréens et autres. Donc vous voyez, je crois qu'il y a quand même tous ces éléments qui entrent en ligne de compte. Et finalement, pour aller pour répondre et être un peu plus positif peut-être que ce que je ne l'ai été depuis le début, quand on regarde le chemin parcouru depuis le début de la construction européenne, mais aussi depuis toutes ces crises dont on parlait, de 2008, 2016, etc., etc., je ne vais pas refaire l'histoire, malgré tout cela, on avance quand même. Et je rejoins ce que vous disiez, Pat, sur le côté, l'Europe, je crois que c'est vous, hein, je ne voudrais pas me tromper et fâcher l'un de mes voisines ou voisins. L'Europe est l'Union européenne est l'exemple même d'un multilatéralisme qui marche. Et ça, c'est très, très important à avoir toujours en tête, parce que ça ne marche pas parfaitement. C'est plus difficile, le multilatéralisme, que le chacun pour soi et je défends d'abord mon intérêt. Mais on a, je crois, une recette qui, malgré tout, in fine, nous permet d'avancer.
Oui, mais Schuman l'a dit, l'Europe se fera par ses crises.
Voilà.
C'est la réalité, en effet.
Joachim Mitterlich, vous qui avez accompagné Helmut Kohl, dites-nous, l'opacité dans le processus de décision, ça, compte tenu de votre expérience, ça donne plus d'efficience, ou bien est-ce que finalement, à plus long terme, avec la transparence des prises de décision, on gagne toujours?
Il n'y a pas de oui et de non. Vous avez besoin, dans une certaine phase, de préparer des décisions, ce que j'appelle à huis clos. C'est normal. Mais de l'autre côté, ça n'exclut pas du tout, de l'autre côté, de montrer la transparence vis-à-vis de l'extérieur. Mais ça n'a pas, je dirais, de sens aujourd'hui, lorsque je regarde, il y a une crise qui éclate, vous voyez les réactions par les médias sociaux pendant 3 jours, et le politique a lentement peur de prendre une décision. Du coup, c'est souvent le cas pour moi, ce que j'observe simplement. Il a peur des médias sociaux quelque part. On appelle ça transparence. Parce que la réaction est n'importe comment et n'importe quoi. Du coup, il préfère, et ce n'est presque plus possible, de préparer quelque chose à huis clos. Par exemple, j'ai un rêve pour les ministres de la Défense de les enfermer dans un monastère sans portable, sans ordinateur, et qu'ils réfléchissent comment mettre en œuvre, en pratique, the European Pillar within NATO. De faire cela, et de manière pratique. C'est mon rêve, si vous voulez. Je sais que c'est presque irréaliste, parce que n'importe quoi, n'importe où, vous voyez par les tweets, par les SMS, ce que j'appelle la transparence est établie en 3 minutes. Ouais. La politique a besoin, ce que j'appelle de la réflexion à huis clos. Même le parlementaire en a besoin, de discuter à huis clos avant qu'il sorte vers le public. C'est-à-dire, l'un n'exclut pas du tout l'autre.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois qu'il y avait madame qui avait une question ici.
Oui, merci. Alessia Setti, PhD candidate in political science at the University of Lausanne. I think a few of you mentioned the fact that some member states might be a problem, you said, Madam Reding, sometimes, or the 27 might have different positions. To what extent do you think that some challenges that you mentioned could be managed through differentiated integration, or would that lead only to further fragmentation? Do you think that in some policy areas we can have a group of member states that go forward and the others maybe might join later, or do you think this is not really feasible? Thank you.
Alors, Madame Reding, est-ce que ce sera tous ensemble ou bien en petits groupes avancés?
Oui, c'est une discussion que nous menons pendant des décennies. L'Europe a plusieurs vitesses. Je pourrais mettre maintenant des noms et des écrits. Je vous dis mon opinion. L'Europe à une vitesse est déjà assez compliqué. On n'a pas besoin de plusieurs layers supplémentaires. Ça pour les 27. Maintenant, si on va vers l'élargissement, par exemple, vers les Balkans, est-ce qu'on pourrait s'imaginer avant élargissement, donc un pas avant l'élargissement? Là, oui, mais pour ceux qui sont dedans, non. On doit faire le contraire. On doit essayer d'éliminer les fragmentations et ne pas ajouter des fragmentations.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on vient de me...
But maybe I can add that, of course, we have seen differentiation. The euro is one important example, where it started with 11 countries. Now there are 20 out of 27 countries member of the euro area. Schengen is another example. So we have seen good examples. And I think with the EU growing, and it will grow for the reasons we heard, this will probably be a feature that's even more necessary. But I think it's always important to keep then the inner circle open for the outer countries. That's an important requisite.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je disais qu'on m'avait montré la petite pancarte qui dit que c'est bientôt fini. Je pense qu'on pourrait encore débattre et parler pendant des heures. On a quand même brassé 75 ans d'histoire, beaucoup d'enjeux. Je voudrais donner la parole pour un tout petit mot de conclusion à tous nos débatteurs et peut-être pour justement aider à cette conclusion. Quelles sont vos principales attentes vis-à-vis de la nouvelle Commission européenne dans sa configuration? Est-ce qu'ils vont être des leaders ou est-ce que vous comptez plutôt sur le Conseil européen? Pat Cox.
I think it is essential that the European Commission sets out a strategic leadership capacity and seeks to encourage, massage, cajole, push, whatever they should do, reluctant members of the Council towards consensus on critically important issues. And I think on that enlargement issue we touched on very briefly, one of the great strengths of European engagement is that it is a voluntary engagement, freely chosen by free and sovereign peoples. This is not old European imperialism or new Russian imperialism. This is by choice of sovereign peoples. And if the sovereign peoples of the Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and so on wish to join, we have a duty of care to accommodate them. It's not instant, it's not easy, but it is a requirement also for our own geopolitical stability on our eastern borders and on our Balkan borders, because if we don't do it, if we leave vacuums, others will fill them. This is the rule of politics. You leave a vacuum, it's filled. So I think the Commission in its strategy should be driving this front and centre and should, as I said, encourage every way they can the European Council to give their support.
Merci de rappeler la volonté des peuples et la responsabilité des institutions. Viviane Reding.
Oui, la Commission est bien constituée. Les responsabilités sont bien divisées. Ce qu'il faut maintenant, c'est faire. On a sur la table toutes les analyses. On a toutes les propositions. On n'a plus besoin de faire d'autres analyses, d'autres propositions et d'autres discussions. Il faut simplement choisir les éléments, et nous en avons souligné plusieurs, et les faire avec des propositions concrètes, où les États membres alors doivent dire oui ou non, et le Parlement doit dire oui ou non. Mais plus de longues discussions autour du sexe des anges. Voilà.
Merci Viviane Reding. Klaus Regling.
Yes, I fully agree with that. We know what should be done. That's not the issue. The problem is that Vivian said earlier are the member states. And under these circumstances, the Commission should be and will be in the lead of formulating a strategy. And then the question is what will trigger stronger cooperation among member states. And that is always difficult to say when you are in the middle of a problem. But I gave some examples earlier where we were in a crisis and Europe rose to the occasion several times. It's not hopeless. It may be triggered by the geopolitics. It may be triggered by Trump. And I agree with Joachim that even if Mrs. Harris is elected, we will deal with that. But Trump could trigger a stronger reaction in Europe because it may become unavoidable. But it's hard to predict what will trigger more cooperation. There will be new leaders coming up eventually in different countries. That remains to be seen. The problem are the member states. We know what to do, and the Commission will have to play a strong role.
Thank you. Sylvie Mathieu.
Merci. Je viens d'un milieu et d'un monde où on travaillait beaucoup plus sur la géopolitique et en fait où notre horizon c'était vraiment le monde et ça fait un petit peu moins d'un an, bientôt un an que j'ai rejoint l'Institut Jacques Delors et ce qui m'a surpris dans un premier temps c'est que le centre du monde pour les Européens c'est quand même Bruxelles. Et ce que je trouve, et ça rejoint ce que vous disiez Madame Reding, c'est que la nouvelle commission, même sur les questions internationales et sur les questions de politique étrangère, est véritablement armée pour relever les défis qui nous sont posés et en particulier le défi, vous le soulignez monsieur, d'arriver à se sortir de cette confrontation Chine-États-Unis qui, qu'on le veuille ou non, structure quand même notre économie mondiale pour proposer peut-être une troisième voie. Donc tout est là, je vous rejoins. Simplement, je trouve que la responsabilité que porte sur ses épaules monsieur Costa, le président du Conseil, est quand même sacrément lourde. J'espère et je croise les doigts pour qu'il soit à la hauteur, mais je pense qu'il va être un personnage clé pour répondre à la question que vous avez posée.
Merci. Joachim Bitterlich, votre pronostic, votre analyse?
Tout est dit, j'ai l'impression. Mon seul appel est Commission et Conseil européen, comprenez que vous devez prendre en main l'agenda des années à venir. Autrement, les extrêmes vont gagner en Europe. Agenda setting. Et arrêtez de rester à la défensive. Vous regagnez uniquement la confiance des citoyens si vous êtes à la tête du mouvement. Chaque homme politique commettra des fautes, c'est normal. Mais ce que les citoyens doivent obtenir, c'est l'impression qu'ils font leur mieux pour le futur, c'est tout.
Alors, moteur et action. Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais qu'on applaudisse nos débatteurs. Voilà, et je rends le micro à Lucie.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for assisting these 2 days of colloquium. I won't hold you hostage any further. Just a very quick word to close off these wonderful 2 days that were so rich and interesting for all of us. First and foremost, on behalf of the foundation, I'd like to thank all our wonderful speakers. To cite Pat Cox, our president, we're very honored to have you here with us today, and we're very happy to have had you. Thank you to the University of Lausanne, of course, for their support, whether it be technical or just in general. And finally, thank you to all my fantastic colleagues who always work so hard to make these events possible. Thank you to Michael Geller, of course, for his whole coordination of this colloquium. And finally, I wish you all an excellent rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.
We will try est tellement chargé qu'il m'a dit que c'est que vers la fin de la semaine prochaine, Madame Monnet jusqu'à la fin de la semaine prochaine. Et lui, il m'a promis de regarder le texte jusqu'à la fin de la semaine prochaine. Et donc, elle peut faire jusqu'à et après ça, c'est chez vous. Parce que je vois une troisième fois, je remercie. Je dois ajouter quelques phrases. Je dois ajouter que je remercie la traduction, que je remercie la fondation. Alors là, je ne sais pas si ça arrive directement chez vous, mais vous deviez encore me former pour ce matin le moment où j'achète la gentillesse. Oui, la relève de Monsieur Nota, elle va chez Madame Monnet.
Ah ouais, c'est 30 ans, c'est pas c'est 30 ans, mais on a eu 11 conversations téléphoniques.
Oui, avec le m'informer on a vraiment son travail, parce que
ça me donne envie de lui
refaire le texte à ses jours. Lui donner
quasi copie.
Il semble que c'est depuis 2 ans, la première fois qu'il y a maintenant un cahier où je sors. Alors je suis comme le relance. Je suis très fière. Dis-lui que c'était très intéressant. Aujourd'hui, c'était, ça m'a fait alors, je remercie. Il y avait même quelqu'un qui m'a dit que c'était déjà prévu la présentation de la traduction française qu'elle part. J'ai dit non, ça vous allons.
076. Oh, 63, de toute façon, 343, 85. Merci. Ah, on fait c'est les deux. Un instant. Ouais, mais c'est vrai que c'était immédiat. J'ai fait 32 ans société. 32 ans. De 86 à 2018. Mais en 2018, vraiment. Et vous savez que les Verts et les socialistes ont les mêmes valeurs. Donc, c'est des questions pertinentes. Bien sûr. Mais oui, je me rappelle très bien de votre présidence. Félicitations, c'est un grand honneur de vous avoir. Du coup, on va se tutoyer. De l'attente de Roger. Par sa mère. C'est génial de t'avoir ici.